Section 20 of A Year with the Saints, translated by a member of the Order of Mercy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. 16. In attending to ordinary business and daily needs, we should not allow ourselves to be transported by eagerness and anxiety, but take reasonable and moderate care, and then leave everything completely and entirely to the disposal and guidance of Divine Providence, giving it scope to arrange matters for its own ends, and to manifest to us God's will. For we may consider it certain that when God wills that an affair should succeed, delay does not spoil it, and the greater part He takes in it, the less there will be left for us to do. St. Vincent de Paul. Before making use of human means, though honorable and necessary, it was the usual custom of this saint to have recourse to the divine, and while recommending the matter to God he would remain quiet and wait until God should give it an impulse to His own ends and for His greater glory. He used to say that Providence gives good success to the plans of those who are willing to follow it, and not run in advance of it. For example, when many charitable ladies importuned him to search for some young girls with whom he might lay the foundation of his congregation of the Sisters of Charity, and he found it difficult to meet with suitable ones, he was not at all discouraged, but contented himself with having recourse to God in prayer, and waiting until His Providence should deign to reveal to him some method of providing for this need. 17. So much earnestness and trouble in seeking means and helps to fortify ourselves in advance against the accidents of this life and to remedy its ills, is a great failure in confidence towards God, for by this going in advance of the order of His Providence, we show that we trust more in our own devices than in His holy guidance, and that we rest more upon human prudence than upon His holy word. St. Vincent de Paul. When Father Alvarez was rector of a poor college, he had a steward who often came to tell him of the daily wants and what was necessary to support the house. Once he asked him whether he had recommended the matter to God. The steward replied that he had no time to pray. "This," rejoined the good superior, "ought to be the first thing. Go into some room and make a little prayer to the Lord. Do you think this flock has no master, or such a one as has no regard for their lives? Go in peace, and remember that this depends not on your efforts." The steward obeyed, and often afterwards found means of support which he considered miraculous. 18. When the will of God is clearly seen in any affair, no matter how difficult, it should be undertaken with intrepidity and pursued with constancy, even to the end, however many and great may be the obstacles which oppose it. For the providence of God never fails those things that are undertaken by His order. St. Vincent de Paul. When this saint had begun an undertaking and felt sure that it was the will of God, he never abandoned it, for any opposition that might intervene. Instead of becoming disheartened, he only showed the greatest constancy and resolution, the more he was harassed and opposed by creatures. When St. Charles had weighed any enterprise he was about to commence, prudently and maturely, and judged it good for the service of God, though it might seem to others sure to fail, he began and prosecuted it with great courage and always with success. St. Francis de Sales said that St. Jane Frances de Chantal showed a most courageous and generous soul in continuing undertakings with which God had inspired her. When St. Francis Xavier saw that the honor of God called him, he went without fearing difficulties or dangers of any kind, and so he attempted nothing which he did not continue, and began nothing which he did not pursue to the end. 19. Let us put our confidence in God, and establish ourselves in an entire dependence upon His Providence. Then we need not fear whatever men can say or do against us, for all will turn to our good. Nay, were all the world to rise against us, nothing would come of it except what was pleasing to God, in whom we have placed our hopes. St. Vincent de Paul. One of his priests having written to this saint that plans were on foot to supplant his congregation, and that persons of influence were supporting these evil designs, he gave this reply: "Let us establish and settle ourselves firmly in total dependence upon God's providence, and then not allow our minds to be overshadowed by these useless apprehensions, for nothing will happen contrary to His holy will." While St. Gregory the bishop had gone down, one night, into the choir for matins, some of his rivals placed a woman in his bed, and after the office made some excuse for accompanying him to his chamber. Then the woman, who had been preconcerted, began to cry out and accuse the bishop of sacrilege. By this he was disgraced through all the city and condemned to imprisonment by the Pope. But God took care of him, for the holy apostles Peter and Paul visited and consoled him in his prison, and he performed many miracles. The woman, meanwhile, was possessed and tormented by the devil, until she appeared before a council of bishops and revealed the plot. She was then cured by the saint, the wicked accusers condemned to the severest penalties, the bishop exonerated by the Pope, and His Holiness publicly declared. 20. Souls that are weak and too much attached to their own reputation make a great stir and commotion and can have no peace, if any calumny is spread against them. It is not thus with generous souls, who aim at nothing except to please God. They know very well that He sees their innocence, and has it at heart more than they themselves, and therefore He will not neglect to defend them, as their greatest good requires. St. Augustine. In a letter to Monsignor Camus, St. Francis de Sales says, "I hear that they are all tearing me to pieces in Paris, but I hope God will patch me up again as good as new, if it is necessary for His service. I do not care for any more reputation than I need for this. For, provided God be served, what does it matter whether it be by good or evil report, by the exaltation or lowering of our reputation? Let Him dispose of my name and honour as He will, since all is His. And if my objection increases His glory, ought I not to rejoice in being cast down?" At another time, when an enormous calumny had been invented against him, his friends, seeing that he made no attempt to justify himself, said that he ought to do so, because his reputation was most necessary to his ministry. But he told them that the Lord knew how much credit he required for his ministry, and he did not wish for more. Bishop Halifax, having been accused of maladministration in his office, would not defend himself when an examination into his methods was ordered, but he left his cause entirely in the hands of God, saying that he well knew his good intentions, and that he expected to be defended by His providence, as the glory of God required whom he desired to serve, and in this way he prospered. 21. When anyone reposes all his confidence in God, God continually exercises a special protection over him, and in this state of things he can be assured that no evil will happen to him. St. Vincent de Paul. For this reason St. Vincent de Paul was never cast down or discouraged in all the afflictions, crosses, and vexatious accidents which befell him or his priests, but he remained always full of confidence in God, with a perfect evenness of temper and constant abandonment to divine Providence. And, what is more, he rejoiced to find himself in such difficulties, as they gave him opportunity to exercise a more perfect, absolute, and total dependence on the divine will. The Emperor Ferdinand II, hearing some remarks about the bad state of the times, said, "Let us do our part, and then leave ourselves and our affairs to the government of God, who will dispose everything well." And when any disaster was feared, he would say, "The Lord will provide." 22. When once we have placed ourselves totally in the hands of God, we have no cause to fear misfortune. For, if any should come to us, He will know how to make it turn to our good, by ways which we do not know now, but which one day we shall know. St. Vincent de Paul. Two singular events which happened, one to St. Francis de Sales, and the other to St. Ignatius Loyola, prove the truth of this statement. When a young secular, St. Francis once visited Rome, and returning one evening to an inn near the Tiber, where he lodged, he found his servants in a dispute with the landlord, who wished him to find some other house, as he hoped to receive more profit from another party, whose luggage he had already taken in, and for whom he wished to dispossess the holy Baron. Nor would the quarrel have ended with angry words alone, if St. Francis, with his usual meekness, had not ordered his servants to do as the landlord wished. He agreed, then, to find another lodging. But scarcely had he done so, when a heavy rain swelled the Tiber and made it overflow the banks, causing an inundation which carried away the unhappy inn and all its occupants, so that not one escaped, nor was there a trace left of the building, which had been considered one of the best of its kind in Rome. When St. Ignatius had arrived in Cyprus, on his return from visiting the holy places, he found 3 vessels ready to sail for Italy. The first belonged to Turkey. The second was a Venetian ship, strong and well equipped, and apparently able to struggle successfully with the most furious gales. The third was a little old boat, leaky and worm eaten. Many urged the master of the Venetian ship to receive Ignatius on board for the love of God, praising him and extolling him as a saint. But when the man heard that Ignatius was poor and had no money for his passage, he answered that if Ignatius was a saint, he did not need a vessel to cross the sea, for he could go on foot, as so many other saints had done. As he would not receive him, Ignatius was obliged to take the old ship, where they welcomed him freely and with much liberality. The 3 vessels set sail on the same day, but after they were all well out at sea, in the darkness of the night a fierce tempest arose, in which the Turkish ship foundered with all its crew on board, the Venetian ran aground, her passengers barely escaping with their lives, and the old craft alone gained the port. We see in these 2 examples how the Lord gave His protection to 2 faithful servants, making use even of the wickedness of men to expel one and exclude the other from places doomed to disaster. It is true that Joseph and Job in the Old Testament suffered great trials, but how incredibly greater were the advantages they derived from them. 23. When we find ourselves in any danger, even a grave one, we ought not to lose courage, but to trust much in the Lord, for where the peril is greater, there also is greater aid from Him who chooses to be called the Helper in dangers and tribulations. St. Ambrose. St. Ignatius Loyola was once on board a ship in a severe storm, when the mast was broken off, and all were weeping and trembling in expectation of death. He alone was cheerful and fearless, remembering that the winds and sea obey God, and that without His permission tempests rise not, neither can they sink any ship, and choosing for himself whatever fate God might choose for him. 24. There are some who so cling to their confidence in God that they cannot abandon it even in extreme cases which appear quite hopeless. Oh, how dear they are to God, and how much help they receive from Him! The Emperor Ferdinand II. once saw the whole North combined against him, but when he was informed of defeats and of the loss and devastation of provinces, he was not at all disturbed, and answered always, "God will deliver me from this tempest." Nor was he mistaken, for when the case appeared desperate, he gained a signal victory, by which he discomfited all his enemies. What could be more desperate than the situation of Susanna, accused, condemned, and led out to death? Yet she trusted in the Lord and was set free. 25. Whoever does not lose courage in unexpected difficulties, but immediately has recourse to God with confidence, shows that this virtue is well rooted in his heart. Rodriguez. We read in the Lives of the Fathers that St. Columban, standing one day, without any thought of danger, suddenly saw 12 wolves coming up to him. They surrounded him, and finally began to nibble at his garments. He was not, however, at all alarmed, and did nothing but invoke God in these words: Deus in adjutorium meum intende, Domine ad adjuvandum me festina, upon which the wolves immediately fled. The Abbot Theodore was asked whether he should be afraid if he heard on a sudden a loud crash and a terrible tumult. "No," he answered, "if the world shall fall in ruins, and earth and sky be blended together, Theodore would not be afraid." 26. The confidence of the Christian soul rests in perfect abandonment to God, above and beyond every consideration of human prudence. Oh, what happiness to walk in this perfect dependence upon a sovereign Providence, remaining continually under the divine protection. St. Jane Frances de Chantal. Such was the confidence of Abraham, who hoped that his posterity would spread over the whole world, according to the divine promise. Though by the order of God Himself He should sacrifice to Him the life of His only Son at a time when He could not expect to have another. Equally great was that of holy Job, who, afflicted in body, bereft of his sons, deprived of his property, and ridiculed by his friends, still said, "Though He should slay me, yet will I always hope in Him." 27. Whoever casts himself into the arms of God's providence and allows himself to be ruled, is borne to heaven in a chariot with all his crosses, so that he scarcely feels their weight. He who acts otherwise goes on foot, dragging them with labor and weariness. St. Bernard. The Emperor Ferdinand II. said of himself, "Trials and troubles would have worn me out long ago, if I had not abandoned all my affairs and myself, as well, to Providence." In a city of Italy there lived a poor young girl who was bedridden and afflicted by many infirmities. Yet those who visited her found her always cheerful, and even the report of a threatened famine caused her no alarm. Being asked how she kept up her cheerfulness in the midst of so many miseries, she replied that all her thoughts rested upon God, that she was like a little bird under the wings of Divine Providence, and therefore she was neither afraid nor anxious about anything. 28. The servant of God ought to fear nothing, and to give himself but little concern even as to the devils themselves; for, every time they fail to terrify us, they lose strength, and the soul masters them more easily. If the Lord is powerful and they are His slaves, what harm can they do to those who are servants of so great a King and Lord? St. Teresa. This saint testifies of herself that she was so timid that she often did not dare to go into a room alone, even in the day. But finally she began to consider what a shame it was for a soul to be alarmed and affrighted at anything but offending God, when we have so great and powerful a Lord who rules everything. Then she thought how all creatures, even the devils, are subject to Him, and how she desired to serve this Lord, and aimed at nothing but to please Him and do His will. In conclusion she said to herself, "What am I afraid of? What do I fear?" And, taking a cross in her hands, she began to challenge the demons, saying, "Come now, all of you, for I am a servant of God. I wish to see what you can do to me." After that she said that she felt full of courage, and all her fears vanished, so that though she saw the demons many times afterwards, she had no fear of them at all, and it seemed to her, on the contrary, that they feared her, because she felt such superiority over them that she regarded them no more than so many flies. A servant of God who was much tormented by the devils constantly sang with joy the psalm, Laudate pueri Dominum. The devils, being angry at this, increased her torments, but she mocked them and said, "I count you as nothing, vermin. I have my Lord with me, and do not fear you in the least." 29. Though one should fall into many and grievous sins and imperfections, he ought never to despair of his salvation, nor lose confidence in God, for the divine clemency is infinitely greater than human malice. St. John Chrysostom. When St. Bernard was severely ill, he had a rapture, in which he seemed to be led to judgment, and there tempted to despair by the devils, to whom he gave this answer: "I confess that I do not deserve paradise for my works, for I know that I am unworthy of so great a good. Nevertheless, my Lord has two claims to it: one, that He is the Son of God; the other, that He died upon the cross. The first is sufficient for Him, and the other He gives to me. For this reason I have hope." St. Vincent Ferrer was remarkable for his confidence in God, which was strikingly illustrated by the following incident. One day he was informed that a dying man had fallen into despair, through considering his great sins, and that he had therefore refused to make his confession. He hastened to his bedside with much hope of winning him over. "My brother," he said to him, "will you, who know that Jesus Christ died for you, despair of His mercy? You would thus grievously slight the great kindness He has shown you." These words made the sick man very angry, and he answered, "Just for that I mean to be damned, in spite of Christ." "And in spite of yourself you shall be saved," replied the Saint. Then, turning to the bystanders, he said, "Let us recite the Rosary to the Blessed Virgin, to obtain from her the conversion of this most obstinate sinner." The Lord was pleased to show how acceptable to Him was the generous confidence of His servant, for before the Rosary was ended the room was filled with a brilliant light, and the great Mother of God appeared, with the Infant upon her arm, all stained with blood. The hardened sinner was moved with love, grief, and compunction at this sight. He made his confession with heartfelt contrition, and a little while after, with a look of heavenly joy upon his face, breathed forth his spirit into the hands of God. Blosius relates of St. Gertrude that she was one day considering which of the many things she had learned from the Lord she might most usefully reveal to men, when she heard His voice in her heart speaking in this manner: "It would be of the greatest use to them to know and remember that I am continually interceding before my Father for their salvation, and that as often as they stain their hearts through human frailty by evil thoughts, I offer to Him in expiation my most pure heart, and when they commit sinful deeds, I offer to Him my pierced hands, and so, however they err, I instantly seek to appease the Divine Father, that they may obtain pardon on their repentance. 30. Finally, if we wish to perform our actions well and to provide for all our needs, we ought from time to time to look to God in imitation of the examples of navigators, who direct their course to the point they seek rather by looking upwards to the sky than downwards where they are floating. To prove the truth of this sentiment, it is sufficient to cast a glance upon the example of so many saints already cited for this month, without referring to any new ones. 31. We have yet to speak of the confidence to be practised in temptations and spiritual aridity; but since this is a point of the highest importance which cannot be treated briefly, it seems more desirable to make it the subject of a separate treatise, which will afford much consolation and help to those who suffer from such trials. End of Section 20. Section 21 of A Year with the Saints, translated by member of the Order of Mercy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. November. Charity. This is the first and greatest commandment: Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart. But the second is like unto it: Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Matthew 22:38. 1. My God and my Lord, what need was there of commanding us to love Thee? Art Thou not most lovely in Thy infinite perfections? And for the infinite love Thou bearest to us, dost Thou not deserve our love? How, then, is it possible that any one should not love Thee? If there is such a person, it must be because he has not deserved to know Thee. For a soul that knows God cannot help loving Him, and loving Him in proportion to his knowledge of Him; so that if he loves Him but little, it is a sign that he knows Him but little, and the more his knowledge increases, the more his love will go on growing. St. Teresa. A very elevated soul once gave her director the following account of her interior: "A great flame of love springs up in my heart, Father, when I clearly perceive, in the time of meditation, how the most holy humanity of the Lord shows how much He deserves our love, by that which He bears to us, while He loves us even as He loves Himself. He manifests this to us, 1. By the great things He has done and is doing for us; 2. By the great desire He has to be loved by us, which He proves by so many extraordinary devices of love, and by remaining, as it were, in a state of violence, because He wishes to communicate Himself and make Himself known to us, that He may be loved by us. But as He finds no access, by reason of our want of proper dispositions, He cannot do it. 3. By the patience with which He bears the coldness He meets with from creatures He has loved so much, and which has no effect upon His unalterable constancy of love. Under these beams of light the soul sends forth various affections, sometimes of wonder that the Divine Majesty should be willing that the creature be loved with an infinite love, and the Creator and Lord with a finite and limited love; sometimes of love, but an excess love, which devours and consumes it, and it would desire the heart of a seraph to blaze and burn with the love of its God; nay, rather would desire to love Him with that same love with which it sees itself loved by Him; and again of insufferable affliction at seeing itself destitute of the knowledge and love of God, which are the height of its perfection, and which would raise it to the Divine Majesty whom it so earnestly desires. This pain is increased by the new perception with which the Lord makes it understand that not loving Him is a positive slight to His power, wisdom, love, goodness, and so many admirable things which He has done and suffered for it. Oh, where can it rest, and how not sink into nothingness beneath this light? I assure you, Father, that when God placed before my eyes the great contempt I had shown to my love, when I did not love Him, I did not know how I remained alive. Surely, if He had not suspended my consciousness, I should have died on the spot. Finally, the soul is enkindled with ardent longings and desires that its Beloved may be known, and sends up aspirations and ejaculations to that infinite goodness, that it may make itself known in order to be loved. It professes its readiness to cooperate in the aid and advancement of souls, in whatever way may be pleasing to the Divine Majesty. It was thus that the loving Lord revealed Himself to me, His most vile and unworthy servant. And when He mercifully imparted to me any of these graces outside of the time of prayer, as when I was conversing with others, or at work, I fell into a trance and was so far unconscious that when the Sisters spoke to me I did not know what they said, though I always understood the Superioress if she required anything as matter of obedience. The Blessed Jacopone was so much affected at seeing so many lose their souls by offences against God in the carnival time, that he went about crying, Amor non amator, quia non cognitur. Love is not loved, because it is not known. St. Philip Neri too often exclaimed, O Lord, I do not love Thee, because I do not know Thee. 2. When one has succeeded in placing his heart wholly upon God, he loses his affection for all other things, and no longer finds consolation in anything, nor clings to anything except God, forgetting his own honor and every interest of his own. St. Teresa. While there is any created thing which can give me consolation and delight, says St. Bernard, I do not dare to say that the love of God is ardent and fervid in my heart. Holy Queen Esther, in the midst of her regal pomp and splendor, could say, O Lord, Thou knowest well that I have never taken delight in dignity and royal apparel, nor in the banquets of the king, nor in anything have I found consolation until this day, save in Thee, my Lord and God. St. Catherine of Genoa, after she had been struck by the arrow of divine love, often cried out, No more world, no more pleasures! And if she had been mistress of 1,000 worlds, she would have thrown them all away to give her whole heart to God. St. Ignatius Loyola went so far as to have lost all attachment to anything that was not God, and he had nothing at heart but to please Him and to gain His love. He said one day that if God should give him the choice of going that moment directly to Paradise, or remaining longer in the world to serve Him and advance His kingdom, even with the uncertainty of his own salvation, he would choose the latter alternative. 3. Alas, we have not as much love as we need. I mean that it would require an infinite amount to have enough to love our God according to His due. And yet, miserable that we are, we throw it away lavishly upon vile and unworthy objects, as if we had a superfluity. St. Francis de Sales. This good saint could not endure to have an affection for anything remain in his heart. He once said, Truly, if I knew that there was one thread of affection in my soul which was not of God or for God, I would instantly sever it. I would rather be nothing than not belong wholly to God without any exception. St. Philip Neri, burning with these flames of love, often cried, How is it possible that anyone who believes in God can love anything but Him? And then addressing to God a loving complaint, he would exclaim, O Lord, since Thou art so lovely and hast commanded me to love Thee, why dost Thou give me but a single heart, and that so small? St. Augustine, to animate his soul to centre all its love upon God, employed such incentives as these: What can please thee in this world, O my soul, or what can gain thy love? Wherever thou turnest, thou seest only heaven and earth. If in both thou findest what is worthy of praise and love, of how much praise and love must He be worthy who has made these things thou praisest and lovest? My soul, till this time thou hast been long occupied and tossed hither and thither by many and various desires, which have ensnared thy heart and divided it among many loves, leaving thee always disturbed and never secure. Recollect thyself now a little, and ask those things that please thee, who is their Maker, and since you admire the form, love its Former, and do not lose thyself in what is made so as to forget Him who made it. Indeed, indeed, my God, Thou art truly worthy to be revered and loved above everything on earth or in heaven. Nay, rather, all transitory things do not deserve to be loved at all, lest we should lose Thy love. 4. When the soul that truly loves God knows that a thing is of greater perfection and more for God's service, it pursues it immediately and without difficulty, on account of the pleasure it finds in pleasing Him. Ah, my God, what else is needed but to love Thee truly, and truly abandon everything for Thy love, for then Thou wilt render all easy. St. Teresa. Such was the conduct of St. Teresa herself, and so she once said, Though I desire the new reform of the Carmelite order, that I might be apart from everything and follow my vocation with more perfection, yet I desired it in such a way that I had clearly perceived it was more for God's service to abandon it. I should certainly have done so with perfect peace and tranquillity. For when I am sure that a thing is more perfect and more for God's service, I am at rest, and in the contentment which I experience in pleasing Him, I instantly lose the pain of leaving something which had given me satisfaction." This was so true that in order never to fail in it, she wished to bind herself by a vow to do whatever she might know to be most perfect and most pleasing to God. A similar vow was also taken by St. Andrew Avellino and by St. Jane Frances de Chantal. In regard to St. Ignatius Loyola, it is well known that he sought in everything not only the glory of God, but His greatest possible glory. For this reason the Church, in the prayer assigned for his feast, sets it down as his distinguishing mark that God chose him to spread His greater glory. 6. When the love of God obtains the mastery of a soul, it produces in it an insatiable desire to labor for the Beloved, so that, though it may perform many and great works, and spend much time in His service, all seems nothing, and it constantly grieves at doing so little for its God, and if it could annihilate itself and perish for Him, it would be well pleased. And so it considers itself unprofitable in all that it does, and regards its life as idle. For, as love teaches it what God merits, by this clear light it sees all the defects and imperfections of its actions, and thus derives confusion and grief from them all. And as it feels that its work is very poor to be offered to so great a Lord, it is at the greatest distance from vainglory and presumption, and from condemning others. St. John Chrysostom. St. Vincent de Paul was equally unwearied and insatiable in laboring for God, and rendering Himself acceptable in His sight, nor did he think he had ever done enough for so great a Lord. In imitation of the apostles, he forgot the good works which were behind him in the past, and put all his thoughts and efforts upon advancing daily in God's service. St. Charles was remarkable for this virtue. As long as he lived, he had an insatiable desire to honor God, and to spread and promote His worship, which spurred him on to labor without weariness. He seemed to grow fresher every day, under labors that succeeded one another without intermission, while those who attended him were often prostrated by fatigue. He never gave the least token of it, as if labor were rest and recreation to him. What is more, after all the great undertakings he performed in the service of God, he was never satisfied with what he had done, but was always inventing new methods, nor did he ever think or speak of anything but God, and what might conduce to His service and honor. 6. When one has arrived at the perfect love of God, he becomes as if he were the only man on earth. He cares no more for glory or ignominy. He despises temptations and sufferings. He loses taste and appetite for all things. Finding no support, consolation, or repose in anything, he goes constantly in search of his Beloved, without ever being weary, so that at work or at table, waking or sleeping, in every employment or conversation, his whole thought and his whole aim is to find the Beloved, for his heart is where his treasure is. In one word, he is like a lover who sighs only for the sight of his love, and whose love is his all. St. John Chrysostom. Zeno the monk, being absorbed in contemplation, went about one day, crying aloud like a madman. He happened to meet the Macedonian emperor, and being asked by him what he was doing, he returned the question. "I am going to hunt," said the emperor. "And I," replied Zeno, "am going to seek God, and I will not stop until I have found Him." With these words he turned away and left him. The Blessed Raymond Lulo was so absorbed in divine love that his sole concern was love, and he could think and speak of nothing else. If any one said to him, "Whose are you?" he answered, "Love's." "Whence do you come?" "From love." "Whither are you going?" "To love." "Who has brought you here?" "Love." St. Honoratus the abbot was so full of the love of God, and so desirous to serve and glorify Him, that not only by day, but even by night, all his thoughts and affections were directed to Him. While asleep he made short and fervent instructions upon the obligation and the manner of loving God, and his very dreams were filled with the love of God, piety, and devotion. Similar was the course of life of the glorious St. Vincent Ferrer, whose heart and mind were full of God. He was always thinking of God. He never spoke but of God, or with God. Whether walking, sitting still, studying, or conversing, he always seemed absorbed in God, whose love appeared upon his lips, in his face, in his eyes, in all his sentiments, in all times and places, even when he was asleep, so that through the cracks in his door his room was often seen illuminated by the splendor that beamed from his face as he slept. The excessive heat which many souls suffered from this sacred flame would seem incredible. St. Aloysius Gonzaga experienced it to such a degree that his face appeared all on fire. St. Catherine of Siena said that natural fire seemed to her cold rather than warm. St. Peter of Alcantara, so that if he plunged into an icy pond, the water would boil as if red hot iron had been put into it. St. Francis de Paula said that he could light lamps with the touch of his finger, as well as with a blazing taper. The Venerable Sister Maria Villani said that on turning her thoughts interiorly to God, or her eyes exteriorly towards some object of devotion, she would feel as if on fire, and she drank upwards of 20 quarts of cold water a day, without being able to extinguish this flame, and the water as she swallowed it seemed as if falling upon glowing iron. She was obliged, on this account, to give up vocal prayers and her usual private devotions, as they all served to fan this interior conflagration. St. Philip Neri, on one of the nights which he passed in the catacombs, threw himself on the ground, exclaiming, I cannot bear it any longer." When he recovered a little, he found that 2 of his upper ribs were bent as if by heat. 2 remarkable incidents deserve special mention at this point. St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi frequently experienced this holy ardor, and one day she was unusually inflamed by it. She began to hurry through the corridors in the garden, and seized the hands of the sisters whom she met. She clasped them closely and said, "Sisters, do you love our love? How can you live? Do you not feel yourselves consumed by love?" She next went to the bell tower and began to ring a great peal upon the chimes. The sisters came in a crowd and asked her why she was ringing. "I am ringing," she answered, "that people may come to love that love by whom they are loved so much." The second occurred in the time of St. Louis of France. One of his ambassadors met one day, in a city to which he had been sent, a woman who was going through the streets with a vase of water in her right hand and a lighted torch in her left, and who cried out with deep sighs, O God, is it possible?" When the ambassador asked her what she wished, she answered, "I would wish, if it were according to the will of God, to extinguish the fires of hell with this water, and to burn up Paradise with this torch, that God might be loved purely for love's sake." 7. It should be observed that perfect love of God consists not in those delights, tears, and sentiments of devotion that we generally seek, but in a strong determination and keen desire to please God in all things, and to take care, as far as possible, not to offend Him and to promote His glory. St. Teresa. St. Jane Frances de Chantal showed how well she understood this great truth by a letter she sent to the superior of a religious who was looked upon as a soul filled with the love of God, because she enjoyed extraordinary consolations. "This good girl," she wrote, "greatly needs to be undeceived. She believes herself highly elevated in the love of God, yet she is not much advanced in virtue. I believe that these fervours and exaltations which she feels are the work of nature and self-love. Therefore she should be shown that the real strength of love consists not in enjoying the divine sweetness, but rather in an exact observance of the rules and the faithful practice of solid virtue, that is, in humility, the love of contempt, patient endurance of insults and adversities, self-forgetfulness, and a love that seeks not to be known except by God. This alone is true love, and these are its unerring tokens. May God preserve us from that sensible love which allows us to live in ourselves, while the true leads us to die to ourselves." Such was the love of St. Thomas of Aquinas, of whom it is recorded that he kept his soul always as pure and true as that of a child 5 years old. 8. The love of God is the tree of life in the midst of the terrestrial paradise. It has, like other trees, 6 parts: roots, trunk, branches, leaves, flowers, and fruit. The roots are the virtues by which love itself is acquired, and the principal are 9 in number: 1. True penitence and reception of the sacraments. 2. Observance of the commandments and rules. 3. Fear of God. 4. Mortification of the passions and appetites. 5. retirement and avoidance of the occasion of sin. 6. Examination of conscience. 7. Humility. 8. Obedience. 9. Charity to our neighbors. The trunk of the tree is surrender of self-will to the will of God. We may discover what the branches are by these words: Sub umbra illiusquam desidera verum ledi. Under the shadow of him whom I had longed for, I rested. The first of these is lively faith, by which the soul can view the Sun of Justice closely without being dazzled. The second, true confidence in the divine protection, by means of which one can escape being cast down in the midst of adversities. The third, ardent desires and firm resolutions and other interior acts, continually directed towards obtaining true love. The fourth, constancy in remaining seated beneath this tree. The leaves are: 1. New graces freely given. 2. Interior sweetness, joy, spiritual gladness, tenderness, or tears. 3. Raptures and ecstasies, referred to in those words: Introduxit me rex in caelum venarium. All these things are called leaves, because they serve as an ornament to the tree, and help to mature the fruit. And in the winter of aridity and tribulation they fall, as the leaves do from a tree, while the love of God remains. The flowers are the works and heroic virtues which the loving soul produces, and are what the bride asks for in the words: Fulcite me floribus, sustain me with flowers. The fruits are the trials, afflictions, and persecutions which the soul bears with patience when God gives them to her, or when she even procures for herself, of her own accord, to serve Him better, or to imitate Jesus Christ in suffering. St. Teresa. It is no wonder that the Saint knew so well how to describe this holy tree, for she kept it planted in her heart, and well developed in every respect. The same idea of love was entertained by a good nun of Naples, called Sister Maria de Santiago, in whose life we read that she thought it resembled a beautiful tree, planted in the good soil of the souls that possess it, and producing abundantly the flowers and fruits of holy works. One of the principal of these, she said, was love of our neighbor, for which she was herself remarkable, because she kept this fair tree of divine love rooted in her soul. 9. Some torment themselves in seeking means to discover the art of loving God, and do not know, poor creatures, that there is no art or means of loving Him but to love Him, that is, to begin to practice those things which are pleasing to Him. St. Francis de Sales. St. Vincent de Paul devoted himself nobly to this holy practice, observing God's law with so much exactness that those who watched him closely assented that no one who was merely a man could fail less than he. He was constantly elevated above himself, upright in his judgments, circumspect in his words, prudent in his conduct, punctual in the practices of piety, and so perfectly united to God, so far as could be judged from the exterior, that it was plain that the love of God was what animated his heart, and ruled in all the powers and sentiments of his soul, to regulate every motion and act. It might be said that his whole life was a sacrifice to God, not only of honours, comforts, pleasures, and all other earthly blessings, but even of what he had received more directly from His most liberal hand, such as light, affections, and holy desires. Nor did he ever wish for anything except that God should be known and glorified in all times and places, and by all kinds of people. To this end alone he directed all that he thought, said, and did. 10. The love of God is acquired by resolving to labor and suffer for Him, and to abstain from all that displeases Him, and by carrying this resolution into practice as occasion arises. But to be able to do it well in great things, it is necessary to attend to it in small. St. Teresa. When this saint was much opposed in regard to her foundations, she said that she never did anything without the advice of experienced persons, that she might not, in any degree, fail in obedience. For, she added, rather than commit the least of those faults they charged me with, I would most certainly have abandoned not one, but 1,000 convents. St. Vincent de Paul was remarkable for this virtue, because he would not consent to anything in the least contrary to justice, simplicity, and charity. He was obliged to bear many unfavourable remarks, indiscreet questions, reproofs, affronts, importunities, and other unpleasant treatment from members of his own order, as well as from others. In such cases he was never observed to give a sign of impatience or to utter a word of complaint, but rather, in order to show the strength of his love for God, he spoke and acted with more than his usual sweetness and tranquillity. 11. A very good way of exercising ourselves in the love of Christ is to acquire the habit of keeping Him present to our mind as far as possible. This may be done in three ways. 1. When we have to perform any action, to represent to ourselves the manner in which He did it while dwelling in the world, as well as the spirit and intention with which He animated it, that we may imitate Him. 2. To think how He is continually looking down upon us from heaven, and shedding upon us the abundance of His graces and counsels. 3. To recognize Him in the person of our neighbor. In this way we shall perform our actions with more ease and perfection. We shall avoid many faults, as well as much anxiety and impatience, and in every service that we perform for our neighbors we shall merit as much as if we did it to our Lord Himself. St. Vincent de Paul. This was St. Vincent's own practice, and it raised him very high in the love of Jesus. He undertook no business, gave no advice, performed no action, without first fixing his eyes mentally upon the example or words of Christ, and on the rewards which He keeps prepared and freely dispenses to such as labor well. And in his dealings with others he beheld in each the very person of Christ. Phrases like these were often on his lips: "As Christ said," "As Christ did." We ought to recognize Christ in all men. 12. Would you know how to stand in regard to the love of God? Here are the signs by which you may discover. As much as the soul grows in divine love, so much do the desires of suffering and of being humbled grow in it. These are the sure tokens of the sacred fire. Everything else is but smoke. St. Vincent de Paul. St. John of the Cross proved how firmly he was persuaded of this. When Jesus Christ appeared to him one day and asked him what reward he desired for the many trials and labors he had borne for love of Him. "No other, O Lord," he replied, "but to suffer and be despised." One day, while they were chanting the words of the Gospel, "Simon Joannes, diligis me placis? Lovest thou me more than these?" St. Matilda fell into an ecstasy and heard Christ saying to her, "Matilda, lovest thou me more than all things in the world?" She replied, "Thou knowest, Lord, that I love Thee." Christ continued, "But lovest thou me so as to be willing to bear all sorts of trials, sufferings, and humiliations for my sake?" "Thou knowest well," she answered, "that no torments can separate me from Thee." Then Christ said, "But if these torments were terrible, would you bear them gladly and readily for love of me?" And Matilda replied, "Yes, Lord, most readily." This great love pleased God so much that He gave her the same merit as if she had suffered all in reality. 13. A sure proof that we love God alone is that we love Him equally in all cases. For, as He is always equal to Himself, the inequality of our love for Him can arise only from the consideration of something which is not Himself. St. Francis de Sales. By this test we may perceive how pure was the love of this saint, for it never increased in prosperity nor diminished in adversity, but in everything was directed equally to the Lord, and through everything he thanked and blessed Him. St. Jane Frances de Chantal also gave this excellent proof of her perfect love of God, by feeling equally contented in consolations and in desolations, of which she suffered many, and for a long time. The reason was, as she said, because in both she desired and sought only the fulfilment of the divine will, by which she knew that both prosperity and adversity were sent to her. "True lovers of God," said a holy soul, "are like the sun, which, though it is sometimes covered with clouds, yet always possesses in itself the same light and the same warmth." 14. The measure of charity may be taken from the want of desire. As desires diminish in a soul, charity increases in it. And when it no longer feels any desire, then it possesses perfect charity. St. Augustine. St. Francis de Sales used to say of himself, "I wish for very few things, and those few I wish for very little. I have almost no desire, and if I were to begin life again, I should wish to have none at all." St. Teresa was so fully persuaded of this truth, that she exclaimed, "O Love, that lovest me more than I love myself, and more than I can understand, how shall I be able, O Lord, to desire more than Thou art willing to give me?" The surest way to discover whether we have the love of God is to see whether we love our neighbor, for the two things are never separate. Be sure, too, that the more you perceive yourself to advance in the love of your neighbor, the more you will do so in that of God. To see how much we love our neighbor is the surest rule by which to find out how much we love God. It is important, then, to notice with great attention how we walk in this holy love of our neighbor. For if it is with perfection, all is done. And so we ought to examine ourselves carefully as to the little things that are constantly happening, without making much account of certain high flown ideas about the great things we mean to say and do for our neighbors, which sometimes come to us in prayer, but which are never put into execution. Saint Teresa. The Blessed Angela de Foligno prayed to the Lord to give her some sign by which she must know whether she truly loved Him and was loved by Him. "The clearest sign," he answered, "of mutual love between me and my servants is that they love their neighbors." Tertullian relates that the mutual love of the first Christians was so manifest that even the heathens were much astonished at it, and said among themselves, "See how these Christians love one another, how much respect they have for each other, how ready they are to render any service, or even to suffer death, for each other's sake." St. Jerome says that in his old age St. John the Evangelist was not able to come to the sacred assemblies, except supported by the arms of his followers. Nor could he preach long sermons on account of the weakness of his voice, but he would constantly repeat these few words, "Little children, love one another." After a time those present became weary, and asked him why he always gave them the same instruction. "Because," he replied, "this is the precept of the Lord, and if you observe this, it alone will be enough." In order that her nuns might be sure whether their actions proceeded from the spirit of charity, St. Jane Frances de Chantal kept inscribed upon the wall of a corridor through which they were constantly passing a list of the distinguishing marks which the Apostle assigns to this sublime virtue. "Charity is patient, mild, without jealousy, without ambition, without self-interest, without aversions. It believes all, hopes for all, bears with all." When any one in the chapter accused herself of a fault against charity, she sent her to read these sentences, which she called the mirror of the convent. She often read them herself, in presence of her daughters. Then, turning towards them with a glowing countenance, she would add, "Though I speak with the tongue of angels and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I give my body to torture and to fire, and have not charity, this profits me nothing." End of Section 21. Section 22 of A Year with the Saints, translated by member of the Order of Mercy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. 16. It is worth while to reflect that God, who has commanded us to love our neighbor, has also prescribed the manner in which we are to love him, that is, as ourselves. This is the rule which cannot be transgressed without fault, and it is so essential that unless our love comes up to this measure, it is not sufficient. St. Wenceslas spent a great part of his wealth in purchasing the children of heathen parents, whom he afterwards caused to be brought up in the Catholic faith. 17. Fraternal charity is the sign of predestination. It makes us known as the true disciples of Christ, for it was this divine virtue that moved him to live a life of poverty, and to die in destitution upon the cross. Therefore, when we find opportunities of suffering for charity, we ought to bless God for them. St. Vincent de Paul. St. Euphrasia, a nun in the Thebaid, was so full of charity that she spent whole weeks without taking food, on account of her excessive occupation in the service of others, and because she devoted to prayer any little time she had left. It was noticed that for a whole year she never sat down, and her active kindness made her dear and lovely in the eyes of the whole convent, so that she seemed to them not an earthly creature, but an angel incarnate. Finally, God revealed to the abbess that He should soon take Euphrasia from her. When this came to the ears of one of the Saint's companions, she wept day and night, and Euphrasia, discovering the cause, was herself grieved at the prospect of losing the opportunity of serving God and her neighbor. Eulogius, a very learned man, resolved to abandon study, and give himself entirely to the divine service. He first distributed the greater part of his property among the poor, but not knowing what kind of life to choose in which he might best please God, he went into the public square, and there found a leper without hands or feet. Touched with a lively compassion, he made a sort of compact with God that he would take care of this man and support him till death, in the certain hope of obtaining mercy from the Lord. He took him then to his house, and took care of him with his own hands for 15 years. At the end of this time, the man, instigated by the devil, began to insult Eulogius, saying that he must have committed many thefts and rascalities, and so made use of him as a means of expiating his sins, but that he did not wish to stay with him any longer, and desired to be carried back to the square, for he was tired of a vegetable diet, and wished for meat. Eulogius brought him some meat, and tried to quiet him, but he would not be pacified, saying that he liked to see plenty of people, and nothing would suit him but to be carried back to the square. Eulogius, not knowing what to do, took him by ship to see St. Anthony, who first reproved them both, and then said that God had visited them with this temptation, because they were near the end of their days. Therefore they must be patient for a little while and not separate, for the Lord had permitted this trial, that they might receive a greater reward. They returned home, and at the end of 40 days Eulogius died first, and then his patient. 18. God loves our neighbors so much that He gave His life for them, and He is glad even to have us leave Him to do them good. How grateful to Him, then, may we believe the services we render them. Ah, if we understood well how important is this virtue of a love of our neighbor, we should give ourselves entirely to the pursuit of it. Saint Teresa. St. Vincent de Paul showed how fully he was persuaded of this truth, for he took this practice so much to heart that he seemed to have nothing else to do. And it may be truly said that there was never a miser who took so much advantage of opportunities to preserve and increase his wealth, as he to do good to his neighbors. This charity, too, had neither restriction nor limitation, but extended to all times and places, and to all persons capable of enjoying its effects. One morning, before Communion, St. Gertrude was grieving that the lateness of the priest prevented her from confessing some slight faults, when the Lord comforted her by a sight of her own soul decked with rich and resplendent jewels, and said to her, "Why are you sad about this, when you are adorned with the mantle of charity, which, you know, covers a multitude of sins?" Moses asked to be blotted out of the book of life, if so he might obtain from the Lord the pardon of his brothers. St. Paul was ready to be an anathema, and St. Paulinus even became a slave in place of another. 19. Oh, how great must be the love that the Son of God bears to the poor, for He chose the state of poverty. He wished to be called the teacher of the poor, and counts most especially as done to Himself whatever is done for His poor. St. Vincent de Paul. Though this Saint loved all men, yet it may be said that he loved the poor above all. He bore them all in his heart. He had more than a father's love for them, so that this most tender affection gave rise in him to a keen sympathy with their miseries, and a constant effort to relieve them. When he met with any case of want, his heart was immediately filled with compassion, and, without waiting to be entreated, he thought of some method of relief, so that his chief care seemed to be to help the needy and assist the poor. He showed this while talking, one day, about the bad weather, which threatened to cause great scarcity of food. "Ah," he exclaimed with a sigh, "how anxious I feel! Not so much for my congregation as for the poor. We will go out and ask food for our houses, or serve as vice curates in the parishes. But what will the poor do? Where can they go? I say with truth that this is my greatest affliction and trial." The same may be said of St. Francis de Sales, with the addition that he showed a positive preference for the poor over the rich, in both temporal and spiritual things, for he looked upon them, as he said, as people abandoned by the Lord to our care. Many other saints were remarkable for their tenderness to the poor. Sister Maria Crucifixa often told her abbess that if it should ever be necessary to refuse alms to the poor, she would contrive not to be present, as she could not bear it. St. Margaret, a Dominican nun, put so much refinement, delicacy, and courtesy into her acts of charity, that the expression, "This is not a leaf from Sister Margaret's book," became a proverb to characterize anything that was not well arranged. St. Hedwig, Queen of Poland, served the poor on her knees, and washed their feet. St. Stephen, King of Hungary, and others did the same. 20. We should love the poor with peculiar affection, beholding in them the very person of Christ, and showing them the same consideration that He did. St. Vincent de Paul. The Venerable Monsignor de Palafox, after he was a bishop, gave a dinner every Thursday to 12 poor men, and was present at it himself. But one day, reading the life of St. Martin, he found that that saint gave food to the poor with his own hands, and washed their feet. He decided to do the same, and carried out his plan inflexibly on every Wednesday and Saturday, distributing to all who came the contents of 2 large pots, and doing this with his own hands, remaining, in the meantime, on his knees, and with his head uncovered. At the close of the distribution, he washed the feet of the poor, and he did all this with the same pleasure and earnestness that he would have felt in doing it to Jesus Christ visibly present. This produced in his heart a great respect for the poor, for he thought every time he met a poor man that he beheld God Himself. 21. To visit and relieve the sick cannot fail to be a thing very pleasing to God, since He has so greatly commended it. But to do it with the greatest ease and merit, we must regard the sufferer not simply as a man, but as Christ Himself, who testifies that He receives in His own person all such service. St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi showed wonderful charity towards all the sick. She visited them every day, and in severe cases many times a day, remaining as long as necessary, and serving them in all their needs, for which she provided herself, or through the superioress or others in charge. By first tasting it herself, she sometimes encouraged them to take food. She bathed them, arranged their beds, and swept their rooms, performing the humblest offices of her own accord. She read spiritual books to them, exhorted them to patience, or gave them consolation, and did everything with so much affection and cheerfulness that she was of the greatest assistance. This charity was universal, free from self-interest, prompted solely by the love of God, regarding the sick now as temples of the Holy Ghost, now as sisters of the angels, and herself always as serving God alone. When medicine was to be given at inconvenient hours, she offered to help the infirmarian. When any required unusual care, she took the whole charge of serving them. She did this in the case of a blind consumptive, of a leper, and of one who had a frightful ulcer, to which she more than once applied her lips. She waited on them all with as much attention as if she had been their servant, bathing them, washing their clothes, and performing all other services through the whole course of their illness, which, in the case of the consumptive, lasted for a year. When the sick were near their end, she remained with them all night, without lying down, sometimes staying beside them for 15 days and nights in succession, now praying for them, now encouraging them with so much feeling and charity that she gave them the greatest comfort, and so all the dying wished to have her present at their passage from this world. St. John Birchmans bestowed similar care upon the sick, in whatever house he was living. He visited them many times a day, and consoled them with spiritual conversation. In summer, he brought them cold water from the fountain, at the hottest part of the day, to moisten their lips and hands. However numerous they might be, he went to see them all every day, and spent most time with those who required the most aid, or received the fewest visits. From the rooms where he found many gathered, he quickly hastened to go to those who were alone. He always told some anecdote of the Blessed Virgin to the sick lay brothers, who watched eagerly for the hour of his visit, and if anything had hindered him, they asked the Father in charge to send him later. So much were they consoled by his presence. When he was not able to visit any brother, he did not fail to inquire of the infirmarian in regard to him. St. Felix the Capuchin showed no less piety for the sick of his order. At his return to the convent, when he had been out to solicit alms, he went around distributing among them any little delicacies and refreshments he had obtained, consoling them at the same time with amiable words, and showing his readiness to render them whatever service they required. Many, too, even persons of high rank, have had a vocation for visiting and serving hospitals. St. Stephen, King of Hungary, went to them by night, alone and in disguise. St. Louis, King of France, served the inmates on his knees, and with uncovered head, looking upon them as members of Christ, and united with Him upon the cross, and so with many others. When St. John Gualberto was abbot, he was so rigorous in regard to the observance of the rule, that he had no mercy on the sick, but desired them to keep it like the well. But this was not pleasing to the Lord, so He permitted him to fall grievously ill, and learned from his own experience how to compassionate sufferers. 22. To have that love for our neighbor which is commanded by the Lord, we must entertain good and amiable feelings towards him, especially when he is disagreeable and annoying to us on account of any defect, natural or moral, for then we find nothing in him to love except in God. The maxim of the Saints was, that in performing works of charity and kindness we ought to consider not the person who receives them, but Him for whose sake they are done. Nor let us be discouraged if we sometimes feel repugnance, for an ounce of this solid and reasonable love is of much greater value than any amount of that tender and sensitive love which we share with the animals, and which often deceives and betrays our reason. St. Francis de Sales. St. Jane Frances de Chantal possessed this love in abundance, for as we read in her life, she never lost an opportunity of showing it for any one, whatever faults and deficiencies she might observe in him. She often exhorted her sisters to do the same, saying to them, "We ought to bear with our neighbors, miserable and ill conditioned though they may be, even in their follies and trivialities, supporting their tediousness and those little vexations which do not harm beyond wearying us. Their want of harmony, too, their weakness and thoughtlessness, occasioned by their deficient knowledge, and all those defects which only regard the person who suffers from them. It is certainly necessary to suffer something, and if our neighbor had no defects and gave us no trouble, how could we have occasion to bear with him?" Having heard that one of her religious found it very difficult to bear with the imperfections of another, she wrote thus to her: "My daughter, often consider how it is said in the Gospel that Jesus Christ loved us, and washed us in His blood, and observe that He did not wait to love us until after we were washed from our impurities, but He loved us when we were vile and impure creatures, and then washed us. Let us, then, love this dear neighbor of ours without examination, though he be poor and ill conditioned, and whatever he may be. And if it were possible to wash away his imperfections with our blood, we should desire to give even the last drop of it for this purpose." The venerable Sister Maria Crucifixa loved all her neighbors, but she showed special kindness for those who were of an unhappy disposition, or who exhibited any dislike to her. Once she was much obliged by a person in minor orders, who, as she afterwards heard, could not receive ordination, because he had not sufficient fortune. She therefore prevailed upon his mother, who was a duchess, to make a settlement of this requisite amount of property upon him. 23. Let us beware of complaints, resentments, and evil speaking against those who are ill disposed to us, discontented with us, or hostile to our plans and arrangements, or who even persecute us with injuries, insults, and calumnies. Rather let us go on treating them as cordially as at first, or more so, as far as possible showing them esteem, always speaking well of them, doing them good, serving them on occasion, even to the point of taking shame and disgrace upon ourselves, if necessary to save their honor. All this ought to be done first to overcome evil with good, according to the teaching of the apostles, and secondly, because they are our allies rather than our adversaries, as they aid us to destroy self-love, which is our greatest foe, and since it is they who give us an opportunity to gain merit, they ought to be considered our dearest friends. St. Vincent de Paul. It was thus that he himself treated those who offended him. He not only pardoned them willingly, and obtained pardon from the government for them when required, but compassionated them, excused them, showed for them the same esteem, affection, and respect as if nothing had happened, and did them all the good that was in his power. Still more, as he was very sensitive regarding fraternal charity, he took care to extirpate from their hearts the root of rancor, and to gain their affection by exonerating them, humbling himself, and bending to them so much that they were obliged to yield to his humility and charity. He was never heard to complain of any one, whatever offence he had given, and still less to blame or accuse any one, so long as his own interests were the only ones involved. One day a missionary of his congregation told him that some people, moved, as he thought, by envy, were putting obstacles in the way of the ordination of some new priests. Yes, he answered, this function frequently excites emulation and envy, but those who are now in opposition may have a good and upright motive, so we ought to preserve all our esteem and respect for them, and believe with them that we are unworthy of such a charge, and that others would execute it better than we. Let us profit by this sentiment, and give ourselves to God, in truth, to serve Him faithfully. St. Francis de Sales was once talking with an intimate friend, who said that, in his opinion, one of the most difficult precepts of Christianity was that of love towards enemies. "For my part," says St. Francis, "I do not know what my heart is made of, or whether God has been graciously pleased to give me one quite peculiar. For I do not find the fulfilment of this precept in the least difficult. On the contrary, I experience so much pleasure in it, that if God had forbidden me to love my neighbours, I should have the greatest difficulty in obeying Him." The following incident shows how truly he spoke. A lawyer of Annecy hated the holy prelate for no visible cause, and was constantly speaking ill of him, injuring and persecuting him, so that he even tore down one of his notices which was fastened upon the church door, and scrawled 1,000 disgraceful figures on his confessional. The saint, who knew all this, met him one day, and made him a friendly bow. Then taking him by the hand with great politeness, he said whatever he thought most likely to make him change his course. But seeing that his words produced no effect, he added, "I clearly perceive that you hate me, though I do not know why. But assure yourself that if you were to put out one of my eyes, I would look at you with the other as amicably as if you were my best friend." His heart, however, was not softened by this, nor by the efforts of his friends to lead him to reconsider his actions. On the contrary, after firing pistol shots at his windows, he, one day, fired at the bishop himself in the street, but by mistake wounded his vicar. For this act he was imprisoned by the Senate, and notwithstanding the interposition of the saint, he was condemned to death. But the holy bishop, having obtained a reprieve, used his influence with the king so successfully as to obtain his pardon. He went himself to the prison to bring the good news, and to entreat him to abandon a hostility for which he had no just cause. Finding him hardened as ever, and ready with calumnies and insults, he knelt and asked his pardon. Finally, perceiving that nothing would move him, he left by his side the pardon he had obtained for him, and took leave, saying, "I have rescued you from the hands of man's justice, and you are not converted. You will fall under the justice of God, from which you cannot escape." This soon happened, for, a little while after, his life came to an unhappy end. In the Lives of the Fathers we read of a monk who, when he knew that another was speaking ill of him, was much pleased, and often visited him when such a one was in the neighbourhood, and sent him presents when at a distance. There was also another, who always showed the greatest love to any one who insulted him, saying to those who were astonished at it, "Those who insult us give us the means of perfecting ourselves, and those who praise and honour us put stumbling blocks before our feet, and give us subjects of pride." An old monk, too, is mentioned, whose cell was often entered secretly by another monk, who robbed him of anything good that he had, particularly in the way of food. This the good old man noticed in silence, and worked harder than before, and ate less, saying to himself, "This poor brother must be in want." When the holy man lay on his deathbed, surrounded by the monks, he saw among them the robber, and begging him to approach, he clasped his hands and kissed them, saying, "Dear hands, how much am I obliged to you! I thank you with all possible earnestness, for by your means I am now going to Paradise." St. Teresa was accustomed to redouble her charity towards those who offended her. St. Francis Borgia used to call those who brought upon him any mortification or trial his assistants and friends. A certain good nun, whenever she received an injury from any one, always hastened to the Most Holy Sacrament and made an offering of it, saying, "O Lord, for love of Thee I pardon her who has done me this wrong. Mayest Thou pardon her for love of me." One of her nuns once told St. Jane Frances de Chantal that another sister had revealed some of her faults, but she had resolved, for the love of God, not to do the same to her in return. The good mother embraced her tenderly, saying, "May it please my God that this resolution shall never pass away from your mind. I should consider myself most happy if I could find it in the hearts of all our sisters." 24. Let us endeavor to show ourselves full of compassion towards the faulty and the sinful. If we do not show compassion and charity to these, we do not deserve to have God show it towards us. St. Vincent de Paul. This saint was never astonished at any fault that he saw committed, for he said that to commit faults was the characteristic of man, as he was conceived and born in sin. This acquaintance that he had with the common miseries of man was what made him behave with so much sweetness and compassion to all sinners. He avoided harshness, and used only mild and compassionate words and ways, even with the most guilty, endeavoring to conceal and make little account of their faults, with a marvellous prudence and charity, and desiring to have his missionaries follow the same course. When St. John Berchmans had charge of the novitiate, if the Father Rector ordered him to impose a penance upon any novice, he felt such great compassion that he would kneel and ask the favour of performing it in his place. But when this was not granted, he imposed it with such suavity that no one ever showed any hesitation about accepting it. St. Francis once said to the Blessed Catanius, his general, "By this I shall know whether you love God and me, His and your servant, that is, by your showing mercy to delinquents. When you find one, do not let him go without his feeling the effect of your kindness, and if you see him fall 1,000 times, love him always more than myself, that you may attract him to good, and never fail to be merciful to all such." St. Francis de Sales had a heart so tender towards evildoers that he often said, "There is no one but God and myself who truly loves wicked men." He gave proof of extraordinary charity towards them by ascribing their misdeeds to human frailty. 25. Among all those who are included under the title of neighbour, there are none who deserve it more, in one sense, than those of our own household. They are nearest of all to us, living under the same roof and eating the same bread. Therefore they ought to be one of the principal objects of our love, and we should practice in regard to them all the acts of a true charity, which ought to be founded not upon flesh and blood, or upon their good qualities, but altogether upon God. St. Francis de Sales. St. Vincent de Paul bore great love to all the members of his congregation. He showed esteem and veneration for all, and welcomed them all with such tokens of affection that each felt sure of being tenderly loved by him. He provided for their needs with great solicitude, for he could not bear to see any of them suffer. He was often seen to rise from the table to set aside dishes for the lay brothers who came after the rest, and if it happened that the cook had nothing for any one, or delayed in serving him, he would give him his own portion, and constrain him to take it. He was most attentive in providing relief and comfort for the sick, often going himself to inquire into their condition and their needs. He advised the infirmarians to take all possible care of them, and the superiors of houses to spare no fatigue or expense in providing for them. He tried to soothe their sufferings by special marks of love and attention, and offered his prayers to God on their behalf. If he perceived that any one of them had a particular desire to speak to him, he left everything to listen to him, and gave him all the time he needed. When he belonged to the king's council, the importance of the business there transacted prevented him from leaving it in the midst to go to them, so that he deferred this work of charity until the evening, after the general examen, and denied himself the necessary repose that he might not deprive them of this satisfaction. When he saw that any one was troubled by interior trials or temptations, he made every effort to free or else to relieve him, and if any one seemed hardened, he did his best to win him by gentleness and mildness, sometimes even throwing himself at the feet of such, and begging them not to yield to their besetting sin. Prostrating himself once before one who was unwilling to yield, he said to him, "I will not rise from this spot till you have granted what I am asking for your good, nor am I willing that the devil should have more influence with you than myself." St. Jane Frances de Chantal had great charity towards all her neighbours. Greater, however, more intense and more tender was that which she bore to her religious, and she strove to have them feel the same towards one another. In an exhortation which she made one day to lead them to this, she said, "Observe, that when Jesus Christ gave the commandment of fraternal charity to His apostles, He did not speak in the same way of the love which they were to bear to all men, and of that which they were to bear to one another. Speaking of the former, He said, 'Love your neighbors as yourself,' but of the latter, 'Love one another as I have loved you, and as my Father loves Me.' Now, the love with which Jesus Christ has loved us, and, still more, that love with which His Divine Father loves Him, is a disinterested love, a love of equality, a love of inseparable union. Therefore, you ought to love one another with this love, to fulfill to perfection the Divine commandment." She herself loved her daughters in this way, with a disinterested love, which had no advantage or pleasure of her own for its aim, with a love of equality, which made her equally affable and kind to all, accommodating herself to the feelings, desires, and inclinations of each, and making herself all things to all with admirable condescension, as far as she lawfully could; and finally, with a love of inseparable union, for no defect, imperfection, or bad quality of theirs could remove them a hair's breadth from her loving heart. 26. God sometimes gives a certain union of heart and tender love for our neighbor, which is one of the greatest and most excellent gifts that His divine bounty bestows on man. St. Francis de Sales. The Saint himself had received this beautiful gift. One day, conversing with a confidential friend, he spoke thus: "I think there is not a soul in the world that loves more cordially, more tenderly, or, so to speak, more amorously than I, for so it has pleased God to form my heart." St. Ambrose relates how this love was shown by a holy contention which took place between St. Theodora the Virgin and a soldier. The saint was put in a position of great danger on account of her faith in Christ, when the soldier came to her and begged her to change clothes with him, that she might escape and save her honor. This she did, but when the Holy Virgin saw her preserver led to martyrdom, she could not endure the thought that her rescue should cost him his life, and publicly exclaimed that it was she who had been condemned, not the one in custody, who was in reality not a woman but a man. The soldier, on the contrary, asserted that the judge had not condemned her to death. This friendly struggle to save each other from death ended in both receiving the grace of martyrdom. 27. It is not enough to have love for our neighbor. We should notice of what sort it is, and whether it is true. If we love our neighbor because he does us good, that is because he loves us, and brings us some advantage, honor, or pleasure. This is what we call a love of complacency, and is common to us with the animals. If we love him for any good that we see in him, that is, on account of beauty, style, amiability, or attractiveness, this is love of friendship, which we share with the heathens. Therefore, neither of these is a true love, and they are of no merit, because purely natural and of short duration, being founded upon motives which often cease to exist. In fact, if we love any one because he is virtuous or handsome, or our friend, what will become of this love if he should cease to be virtuous or handsome, or to love not, or still worse, if he should become our enemy? When the foundation upon which our love rested sinks, how can it support itself? The true love, which alone is meritorious and lasting, is that which arises from the charity which leads us to love our neighbor in God and for God; that is, because it pleases God, or because he is dear to God, or because God dwells in him, or that it may be so. There is, however, no harm in loving him also for any honorable reason, provided that we love him more for God's sake than for any other cause. Yet the less mixture our love has of other motives, the purer and more perfect it will be. Nor does this hinder us from loving some, such as our parents and benefactors, or the virtuous, more than others, when such preference does not arise from the greater good they do to us, but from the greater resemblance they have to God, or because God wills it. Oh, how rare is a love of this sort, which deserves to be called true love! Nolite amore secundum camen, sed secundum Spiritum Sanctum. Love not according to the flesh, but according to the Holy Spirit. St. Francis de Sales. For this reason he entertained great love and universal respect for all his neighbors, because he saw God in them, and them in God, and this made him very exact in all the duties of courtesy, in which he was never known to fail towards any one. He felt, indeed, great tenderness for his friends, but because he loved them with relation to God, he was always ready to deprive himself of them. Writing to the superioress of a convent, he gave her this warning: "Hold the balance evenly among your daughters, that their natural gifts may not cause you to divide your affection and your good offices unjustly. How many persons are there exteriorly polished, who are very pleasing in the eyes of God? Beauty, grace, agreeable conversation, and manners suit the taste of those who still live according to their inclinations. Charity regards true virtues and beauty of soul, and diffuses itself over all without partiality." St. Vincent de Paul made it one of his chief practices to regard God alone in all men, and to honor in them the divine perfections; and from this most pure sentiment there sprang up in his heart a respectful love for all, and especially for ecclesiastics, in whom he most clearly recognized the image of the power and holiness of the Creator. Therefore he charged his missionaries to love and honor them all, and never to say anything but good of them, especially in preaching to the people. He provided for their needs with particular care, as he was unwilling to see the dignity of the priesthood lowered in their persons. Among the acts of charity which St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi resolved to perform was this: that she would reverence and love creatures only because God loves them, and that she would rejoice in the love He bears them, and the perfections He communicates to them. At the point of death, she said that though she had borne great love to all her sisters, she had loved them only in fulfilment of the precepts of love left us by Jesus Christ, and because He had loved them so much, and that outside of this she had never had the slightest attachment to any creature. 28. Ah! when shall we see ourselves steeped in sweetness and suavidity towards our neighbours? When shall we see their souls in the sacred bosom of Jesus? Whoever looks upon his neighbour in any other position runs a risk of loving him neither purely nor perseveringly nor impartially. But in such a place who would not love him? Who would not bear with him? Who would not be patient with his imperfections? Who would consider him an object of dislike? Now, our neighbour is truly there in the bosom and within the heart of the Divine Saviour. He is there as one most beloved and altogether amiable, so that the loving Lord dies from pure love of him. St. Francis de Sales. This was the principal reason why this holy prelate was so mild, so tender, so respectful, so patient to every one, because he saw them all in the heart of Jesus. He manifested this one day when Monsignor de Bellier, his penitent, complained to him of the great respect he showed him. "What respect," he answered, "do you show Jesus Christ, whom I honor in your person?" It was one of the chief maxims of St. Vincent de Paul not to regard his neighbour according to exterior appearance, but as he was in the sight of God. "I must not regard," he said, "a poor peasant or country girl as to their exterior or their natural gifts, for often one can hardly recognize in them any resemblance to a rational creature, so rude and earthly are they. But when we look upon them with the eye of faith, we shall find them so deeply graven on the heart of the Son of God that He even gave His life for each of them. How desirable it is to view our neighbour in God Himself, that we may make the account of Him which Christ our Lord made." 29. When Raguel saw the young Tobias without knowing him, he exclaimed, "Oh, how much this young man resembles my cousin!" And when he heard that he was the son of that cousin, he embraced him warmly and gave him 1,000 benedictions, weeping over him for love. Now, why was this? Not, certainly, on account of his good qualities, for he did not yet know what his disposition was, but because, as he said, "Thou art the son of an excellent man, and resemblest him greatly." See what love does when it is true. If we love God truly, we should do as much for all our neighbours, who are all sons of God and resemble Him much. St. Francis de Sales. This reflection made the Saint show great respect to all. One day someone criticized him for showing too much honour to the servant of a nobleman who had brought him a message. "I do not know how to make these distinctions," he answered. "All men bear the image and likeness of God, and that furnishes me with a sufficient motive for respecting them." When he met persons or even animals heavily loaded, he stood aside that they might pass more easily, and never permitted his servants to make them stop or go back, saying, "Are they not men like we, and do they not at this moment deserve more consideration than we?" St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi often looked upon the image of God as seen in her sisters, which excited in her heart great love for them, and when any one of them seemed to her imperfect and unworthy, she thought perhaps she had some hidden gift which caused God to find pleasure in her. A holy religious once wrote this resolution: "I will love God for Himself, and for love of Him I will serve those who bear His image. I will give my heart to Him, and my hands to my neighbor, that he may be united to God." The Venerable Maria Serafina de Dio said of herself that she consoled herself under trials, in associating with her neighbours, by the thought that she was beholding in them the image of God, and that therefore she could not do less than treat them with benevolence and cordiality. When Theodosius was extremely provoked, and resolved to punish severely the inhabitants of Antioch, who had insulted the statue he had raised to Flaccilla, whom he had greatly loved for her rare virtues, St. Macedonius begged one of his courtiers to say these words to him in his name: "O Emperor, truly you will be right in punishing these insolent men, but I pray you remember that they are the loving images of God, and if you dare to let loose your rage against the images of the Lord, you may draw down upon yourself His anger. For, if ill treatment to the image of your dear consort displeased you so much, how can you suppose that God will not be equally displeased with what you may inflict upon His images, so dear to Him, that to recast them He had not spared to shed all His blood?" These words, uttered with great simplicity, and reported to the emperor, did much to pacify him. 30. Among the means best fitted to acquire and preserve union and charity with God and our neighbour, none can be found better and more efficacious than holy humility, and abasing ourselves beneath all, esteeming ourselves the least, the worst, and lowest of all, and thinking evil of no one. For self love and pride are what lead us to sustain our opinions against those of our neighbour, and thus cool the love we owe him. St. Vincent de Paul. A Franciscan preacher once severely reproved in a sermon a vice of which a marquis present in the congregation was guilty. The latter went to the monk after the sermon, loaded him with insults, and ended by saying, "Do you know me?" "Yes," replied the Father, "and I consider it a great honour to be acquainted with such a nobleman, for me, who am but a rustic by birth, and the humblest of men," adding other things in his own disparagement. The Marquis was pacified by this reply, and went away with tears in his eyes, and full of veneration for the priest. The Abbot Multius removed to a cell in a place called Aradian, but being much troubled there by another monk, and fearing that there could be no harmony between them, he returned to his former abode. The monks of Aradian grieved much at his departure, and after a while went after him, taking with them the one with whom there had been difficulty. When they came near the abbot's cell, they took off their outer garments, and left them in charge of this brother. Multius, on seeing the monks, welcomed them kindly, and asked what had become of their cloaks. Hearing that they were near at hand, in the care of his former companion, he was much pleased, and instantly hastened out to meet him. Then, throwing himself at his feet, he asked his pardon, and embraced him, and took him to his cell with the rest. He kept them all for 3 days, and afterwards went back with them to Aradian. End of Section 22. Section 23 of A Year with the Saints, translated by a member of the Order of Mercy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. December. Union. Qui mana in charitate in Deo manat, et Deus in Deo. Who abideth in charity abideth in God, and God in him. John 4:16. 1. The object of all virtues is to bring us into union with God, in which alone is laid up all the happiness that can be enjoyed in this world. Now, in what does this union properly consist? In nothing save a perfect conformity and resemblance between our will and the will of God, so that these two wills are absolutely alike. There is nothing in one repugnant to the other; all that one wishes and loves, the other wishes and loves; whatever pleases or displeases one, pleases or displeases the other. St. John of the Cross. The Blessed Virgin possessed this perfect union, and St. Bernard says of her that she kept her eyes on the watch, and her consent fully prepared for every token of the divine will. The Venerable Mother Serafina de Dio had advanced far on this road, for, In an account which she gave of herself to her director, she was able to say: "My soul seems to be so much in harmony with Our Lord that whatever He operates in it always appears most fitting, for it is the very thing which it wills for itself. Whatever comes to my soul is a sweet morsel made on purpose for it, and it seems unable to desire anything else, so that it never experiences bitterness or trouble." Once, when she accused herself of want of conformity to the Divine Will, she received at that moment a ray of light, by which she saw how beautiful is the will of God so clearly that she remained for some time overcome with astonishment that a creature, sprung from nothing, should fail to love the most holy and beautiful will of its Creator. 2. Those deceive themselves who believe that union with God consists in ecstasies or raptures and in the enjoyment of Him. For it consists in nothing except the surrender and subjection of our will with our thoughts, words, and actions to the will of God, and it is perfect when the will finds itself separated from everything and attached only to that of God, so that every one of its movements is solely and purely the volition of God. This is the true and essential union which I have always desired and which I constantly ask of the Lord. Oh, how many of us there are who say this, and who think we desire only this! But, wretched that we are, how few are ever to attain it! St. Teresa. This saint never ceased to wonder at the great privilege which man possesses in being able to unite himself to his Creator, and at the wonderful desire which so great a sovereign entertains to see him united to himself. This, therefore, was the object of her keenest desires, and for this she strove more ardently than for anything else. St. John the Baptist abode in the desert for 24 years. God knows how his heart was touched with love for his Saviour even from his birth, and how earnestly he desired to enjoy His presence, and yet, devoted to the simple will of God, he remained there discharging his duty, without even once seeing Him. And after he had baptized him, he did not follow Him, but continued at his office. What can we say of all this, if not that he was a spirit detached from all things and from God Himself, to perform His will? This example, said St. Francis de Sales, overwhelms my soul with its grandeur. 3. Union with God takes place in 3 ways: by conformity, by uniformity, and by deiformity. Conformity is a complete subordination of our will to the Divine Will in all our actions and in all occurrences and events, so that we will and accept all that God wills and sends, however painful and repulsive it may be. Uniformity is a close union of our will with the Divine Will, by which we will not only all that God wills, but we will it solely because He wills it, and so all repugnances are banished. Deiformity is a transformation which renders our will one with that of God, so that it is no longer conscious of itself, as if it were no longer in existence, but only feels in itself the Divine Will, and, as if it were changed into it, no longer desires in any of its acts and operations anything, even what is most holy, with or through the created will, but only in the uncreated, made its own by transformation. Father Chilier Guicciardi. St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi attained to all 3 degrees of union. As to the first, she often said, with great feeling, "If I should see hell open, and believe that it was the Lord's will that I should suffer eternally in those flames, I would plunge into them instantly of my own accord to accomplish His Divine Will." For the second, she said, in an ecstasy that she had at Pentecost, "I protest that I do not seek or desire the Holy Spirit except according to the will of God. I desire His presence, and I do not desire it because I do not wish to desire it of myself, as of myself, so that if God should give it to me to do my will, and not His as His, but as mine, even though His will were to be found in this, yet not primarily and totally His, I should be in no wise content. So much does it concern me not to wish to possess or make my own what I have given to Him, and what I wish should be wholly His, that I may be able to say with perfect truth in everything, Fiat voluntas tua." For the third, she lived as one dead to herself, without any intention or will of her own. In another ecstasy the Lord showed her her own soul in this condition, under the form of another soul, which she described in these terms: "She follows her Spouse without understanding, without speaking, without hearing, without tasting, and, so to speak, without acting, and as if dead. She thinks only of following the interior attraction of the Divine Word, that she may not offend Him. 4. Conformity to the Divine Will is the most powerful means to overcome every temptation, to eradicate every imperfection, and to preserve peace of heart. It is the most efficacious remedy for all ills, and the treasure of the Christian. It includes in itself, in an eminent degree, mortification, abnegation, indifference, imitation of Christ, union with God, and in general all the virtues, which are not virtues at all, except as they are in conformity with the will of God, the origin and rule of all perfection. St. Vincent de Paul. St. Vincent de Paul was himself so much attached to this virtue that it might be called his characteristic and principal one, or a kind of general virtue which spreads its influence over all the rest, which aroused all his feelings and all his powers of mind and body, and was the mainspring of all his actions. If he placed himself in the presence of God in his prayers or other exercises, his first impulse was to say with St. Paul, "Lord, what wilt Thou have me to do?" If he was very attentive in consulting and hearkening to God, and showed great circumspection in distinguishing between true inspirations proceeding from the Holy Spirit, and false ones which come from the devil or from nature, this was in order to recognize the will of God with greater certainty, and be in a better position to execute it. And, finally, if he rejected so resolutely the maxims of the world, and attached himself solely to those of the Gospel, if he renounced himself so perfectly, if he embraced crosses with so much affection, and gave himself up to do and suffer all for God, this, too, was to conform himself more perfectly to the whole will of his Divine Lord. The Blessed Jacopone, being astonished that he no longer felt any disturbance in evil impulses, as he did at first, heard an interior voice saying, "This comes from your having wholly abandoned yourself to the Divine Will, and being content with all it does." 5. So great is the delight which the angels take in executing the will of God, that, if it were His will that one of them should come upon earth to pull up weeds and root out nettles from a field, he would leave Paradise immediately, and set himself to work with all his heart and with infinite pleasure. Blessed Enrico Sossone. He himself was so satisfied with the will of God, so completely attached and submissive to it, that he said, "I would rather be a bat at the Divine Will than a seraph at my own." So great was the love and tenderness which St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi entertained for the Divine Will, that at the mere mention of it she would be lost in an ocean of spiritual joy, and sometimes rapt into ecstasies. One evening, after most of the others had retired to sleep, some one said of a certain sister that she had a great desire to do the will of God. The Saint replied joyously, "She is right, for to do the will of God is a thing most lovely." And with that she remained bereft of sense, for she could not bear the flood of sweetness that flowed over her at the thought of the loveliness of the Divine Will. She then ran through the dormitory exclaiming, "How amiable is the Divine Will!" and calling upon the rest to come and confess this with her. She excited such a tender emotion in them all, that they arose and went with her to the chapel, where they all unitedly confessed with a loud voice that the Divine Will was worthy of all love, and the hearts of all were deeply stirred. 6. A soul truly resigned to God has no affection for any created thing, for it sees clearly that all its possessions except God are vain and a nullity. So its single object and aim is to die to itself, and to resign itself actually and always in all things. Blessed Enrico Sossone. St. Vincent de Paul excelled in this, for he lived quite apart from all creatures, and even from himself, taking no care but to depend in everything upon the will of God and the disposal of His holy providence. The soul of the Venerable Mother Seraphina had arrived at this happy state, as appears from an account she gave of herself to her director, in these terms: "The state in which I find my soul at present is, that I wish for nothing except what God wills. The will and pleasure of God has so penetrated me, and has become so wrought into my own will and pleasure, that it has made itself mine, and I desire that alone which God wills, and not only do I will it, but I am not able to will otherwise, nor to have any pleasure or will but His. This is my sole and complete will, nor have I need to produce or repeat acts of it, for I have it deeply impressed upon my soul. I love and esteem it, and rejoice in it supremely." 7. As the Lord knows for what we are all adapted, He gives to all their positions as He sees to be most for His own glory, for their salvation, and the good of their neighbours. Our mistake, then, is in not submitting ourselves totally to whatever He wishes to do with us. Saint Teresa. When her director expressed a doubt as to the spiritual course she was following, and bade her try another, Saint Teresa was only able to place herself in the hands of God, that He, who knew what was best for her, might wholly accomplish His holy will in her heart. The Lord one day gave St. Francis Borgia the choice of life or death for his wife, who was seriously ill, but he replied with emotion, "Why, O Lord, commit to my judgment what lies solely in Thy power? What concerns me is to follow Thy holy will in all things, since no one knows better than Thou what is best for me. Do then what is most pleasing to Thee, not only with my wife, but with my children also, and with myself. Fiat voluntas Tua." A blind man earnestly entreated St. Vedastus, on the day of his festival, to give him sight, and obtained it. Then, continuing his prayer, he said that he would not have asked it except as a help towards his salvation, when it was immediately taken away again. The same thing happened to another, who was cured of a painful infirmity by the intercession of St. Thomas of Canterbury, but who protested to the saint that if health was not best for him he did not desire it. Upon this, his previous illness instantly returned, at which he felt no disappointment. 8. We ought to submit to the will of God, and be content in whatever state it may please Him to put us, nor should we ever desire to change it for another, until we know that such is His pleasure. This is the most excellent and the most useful practice that can be adopted upon earth. St. Vincent de Paul. The Venerable Father de Ponte told an intimate friend that he was glad of all his natural defects of appearance and speech, since it had pleased the Lord to mark him with them; that he was glad also of all his temptations and miseries, both interior and exterior, since God so willed it; and that if it were the will of God that he should live 1,000 years, oppressed by far greater trials, and in the deepest darkness, provided that he should not offend Him, he would be quite content. When the news of her husband's death in the war was brought to St. Elizabeth, she instantly raised her heart to God and said, "O Lord, Thou knowest well that I preferred his presence to all the delights of the world; but since it has pleased Thee to take him from me, I assent so fully to Thy holy will, that if I could bring him back by plucking out a single hair from my head, I would not do it except at Thy will." 9. Never believe you have attained such purity as you should, whilst your will is not freely and gladly submissive to the holy will of God, as to all and in all, even in things the most repugnant. St. Francis de Sales. St. Jane Francis de Chantal said that he arrived at such purity, as she knew from himself, for in his deepest afflictions he experienced a sweetness 100 times greater than usual. This came from the intimate union with God that he enjoyed, which made the bitterest things most delicious to him. The Congregation of St. Vincent de Paul having met with a serious loss of property, he informed a friend of it in this way: "As you are one of our best friends, I cannot do less than let you know of the loss we have met with, not indeed as a misfortune that has befallen us, but as a favour which the Lord has bestowed on us, and in the intention that you may help us to render Him due thanks. Favours and benefits are the name I give to the afflictions that He sends us, especially when they are well received. And as His infinite goodness has ordained this loss, He has made us accept it with perfect and entire resignation, and, I can safely say, with as much gladness as we should have felt at any prosperous event." 10. One act of resignation to the Divine will, when it ordains what is repugnant to us, is worth more than 100,000 successes according to our own will and pleasure. St. Vincent de Paul. How much, in the midst of all his disasters, did holy Job merit before God by his Dominus Dedi Dominus Abstulit: "The Lord hath given, and the Lord hath taken away." 11. Perfect resignation is nothing else than the complete moral annihilation of thoughts and affections when one renounces himself totally in God, that He may guide him as He wills and pleases, as if one no longer knew or cared for either himself or anything else except God. It is thus that the soul, so to speak, loses itself in God, not indeed as to its nature, but as to the appropriation of its powers. Blessed Enrico Sassone. St. Catherine of Genoa was one of those happy souls who attained to a share in this holy annihilation, in which, as she herself attests, she had no longer thoughts, affections, or desires as to anything, except to leave God to do with her and in her all that He might will, without any choice or resistance on her part, and that this gave her in all circumstances and occasions a delight like that of the blessed, who have no will but that of their God. And so she was able to say, "If I eat, if I drink, if I speak, if I am silent, if I sleep, if I wake, if I see, if I hear, if I meditate, if I am in the church, if I am in the house, if I am in the street, if I am sick or well, in every hour and moment of my life, I would do only God's will, and my neighbour's for His sake. Or rather, I would not wish to be able to do, to speak, or to think anything apart from the will of God. And if anything in me should oppose itself to this, I would wish that it might instantly become dust and be scattered to the winds." A young girl, whom she had never seen, once appeared to St. Aldegonde, and told her, in the name of the Blessed Virgin, that she might ask what she chose, and it would be given her. But the Saint replied cheerfully that she desired nothing, except that in all things the holy will of God should be accomplished, to which she would be resigned with all possible satisfaction and pleasure. 12. When shall it be that we shall taste the sweetness of the Divine will in all that happens to us, considering in everything only His good pleasure, by whom it is certain that adversity is sent with as much love as prosperity, and as much for our good? When shall we cast ourselves unreservedly into the arms of our most loving Father in heaven, leaving to Him the care of ourselves and of our affairs, and reserving only the desire of pleasing Him and of serving Him well in all that we can? St. Jane Frances de Chantal. When St. Peter was about to hold a disputation with Simon Magus, he received word from his opponent that on account of important business he should be obliged to defer the debate for 3 days. St. Clement, who had just been converted, and who was with St. Peter, was grieved at this delay, but St. Peter consoled him by saying, "My son, it is to be expected of the heathens that they will be troubled when things do not turn according to their wishes. But for us, who know that the Lord guides and disposes all things, we ought in all cases to abide in great peace and consolation. I will show you that this event which displeases you is in reality for your good, for if the discussion had taken place now, you would have understood but little of it, but later you will understand it better. For in the meantime I will instruct you, so that you will be able to derive greater advantage from it. So, for the future, beware of separating yourself from the Divine will, and always be sure that whatever happens will be for the best." We read of the wife of a soldier who used to say, when a misfortune happened to any one, "It will be the best thing for him." She made the same remark on the occasion of her husband's losing an eye. Some time after, it happened that the king was near death, and according to the custom of the country, someone was chosen to honour his death by dying with him. It happened that the soldier was chosen, but when he was informed of his ill fortune, he immediately said, "But no! It is not proper that so great a king should have a one-eyed man for his companion in death." This was approved by all, so that the loss of an eye was no evil, but a great piece of good fortune. 13. To lose ourselves in God is simply to give our own will to Him. When a soul can truly say, "Lord, I have no other will than Thine," it is truly lost in God and united to Him. St. Francis de Sales. The Venerable Father de Ponte made this prayer, and repeated it every day: "Fiat Domini de me, in me, pro me, et circa me ad omnia mea, sancta voluntas Tua, et omnibus et per omnia et internum." Concerning me, in me, for me, in regard to me, and all that I have, may Thy holy will, O Lord, be done, in all things, and through all things, and to eternity. The Lord appeared one day to St. Gertrude, and said to her, "Daughter, behold, I bring you in one hand health, and in the other sickness. Choose which you please." The Saint, throwing herself at His feet, with her hands crossed upon her bosom, answered, "O Lord, I pray Thee not to consider my will at all, but solely Thine own, and to do with me whatever will result in Thy greatest glory and satisfaction, for I have no desire except to have whatever Thou wishest me to have." The Lord was much pleased with this reply, and added, "Let those who desire that I should often visit them Give me the key of their will, and never take it back." Instructed by these words, the Saint composed for herself this aspiration, which she frequently repeated ever after: "Non mea sed tua voluntas fiat, Jesu amatissime." "Not my will, but Thine be done, O most loving Jesus." 14. There are many who say to the Lord, "I give myself wholly to Thee, without any reserve." But there are few who embrace the practice of this abandonment, which consists in receiving with a certain indifference every sort of event as it happens in conformity with Divine Providence, as well afflictions as consolations, contempts and reproaches as honor and glory. St. Francis de Sales. St. Vincent de Paul was a brilliant example of this. In all places, times, occupations, and circumstances, in tribulation and consolation, in illness, in cold and heat, in encountering reproaches, calumnies, the loss of friends or property, he was never troubled or disturbed. But, as if all these events had been similar, he remained in great peace and tranquillity of soul, which he manifested by the sweetness of his words and the serenity of his countenance. For he never lost sight of his maxim, that nothing happens in this world except as ordained by Divine Providence, into whose hands he had entirely abandoned himself. This once made a priest say in astonishment, "Monsieur Vincent is always Monsieur Vincent." Particular examples may be of use to illustrate this. When he received news that parties were endeavouring to bring lawsuits and disturb his missionaries in their possessions and in houses and lands which they had acquired, his usual reply was, that nothing would succeed except what God pleased, and that as he was master of all their goods, it was just that he should dispose of them according to his divine will. When one of the most important and useful members of his congregation was seriously ill, he wrote thus to a person who was much grieved at the misfortune: "It seems as if our Lord wished to take his portion of our little company. It is, I hope, entirely His, and so He has a right to make use of it as He sees best. For myself, the chief desire that I have is to wish nothing except the fulfilment of His divine will." In fact, though the preservation of his congregation was so dear to him, he never desired either that or its increase and progress, except in so far as he was sure that God willed it, so that, as he once said, he would not have taken a step or uttered a word to that end, except in entire dependence on the divine will. His practice was the same in what regarded himself personally, for he bore his many and great infirmities with much pleasure and tranquillity of soul. In the last year of his life he perceived clearly, and often said, that he was gradually failing, but always with a perfect indifference which proved that living and dying, suffering and relief, were the same to him. He was indifferent as to the food and the remedies given him, and though he would sometimes express the opinion that one thing or another did him harm, still he always took what the physicians ordered him, and seemed as well pleased with bad results as with good. In everything he regarded only the accomplishment of God's good pleasure as the sole object of his desire and of his joy, nor was there ever observed in him, either in sickness or health, the least token of a feeling opposed to this holy disposition. St. Jane Frances de Chantal had attained the same height, for we read of her that she received with equal indifference whatever occurred, whether adverse or prosperous, as she had no desire but that God would do with her and in her regard whatever He might please. For this reason she never cared to think about what might happen to herself or others in the future, that is, about what she should do in such or such circumstances, as, for example, if she were in extreme want, whether she would go out and beg, or wait for help from Divine Providence. She said that in such a case she would ask the Lord with fresh confidence what she was to do, leaving herself, meantime, in His hands. She was once asked whether, in the various dangers she had encountered by land and water in her frequent journeys, she had always hoped that God would rescue her from them. She replied that she had hoped not for rescue, but only that the Lord would do what might be for His greater glory, by freeing her from the danger, or by leaving her to perish in it, and that in this total dependence on the Divine disposal her heart remained peaceful, tranquil, and at rest. To conclude, a holy and learned man said that a soul perfectly resigned is like a body that forms a perfect square, which stands firmly on whichever side it may be thrown. 15. If you give yourselves to the practice of holy abandonment, though you may not perceive that you gain at all, you will, in fact, advance greatly, as it is with those who sail upon the open sea with favourable winds, trusting wholly to the care of the Pilot. St. Francis de Sales. There was in a certain monastery a religious whose power of working miracles was so great that the sick were cured by merely touching his garments or his cincture. The abbot wondered at this, as he saw nothing remarkable about him, and one day asked him for what cause God worked so many miracles by his means. "I do not know," he replied, "for I do not fast, nor use the discipline, nor watch, nor pray, nor labor, any more than others. This only I perceive in myself, that nothing which happens disturbs or disquiets me, but my soul remains in equal tranquillity in the midst of all events, however unfortunate they may be for myself or others, because I have left everything in the hands of God. And so, whether it be prosperity or adversity, whether it be little or much, I take all as coming from His hands." "Then were you not troubled the other day," rejoined the abbot, "when the enemy burned our granary?" "Not in the least," was his answer. "Here, then, is the cause of your miracles," returned the abbot. A farmer who always had larger and better crops than his neighbours was once asked the reason by one of them. "Why, I always have the weather to suit me," he answered, "for I always wish it to be as God wishes it, and not otherwise." End of section 23. Section 24 of A Year with the Saints, translated by a member of the Order of Mercy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria Therese. 16. One of the principal effects of holy abandonment in God is evenness of spirits in the various accidents of this life, which is certainly a point of great perfection and very pleasing to God. The way to maintain it is, in imitation of the Pilots, to look continually at the pole star, that is, the Divine Will, in order to be constantly in conformity with it. For it is this will which, with infinite wisdom, rightly distributes prosperity and adversity, health and sickness, riches and poverty, honor and contempt, knowledge and ignorance, and all that happens in this life. On the other hand, if we regard creatures without this relation to God, we cannot prevent our feelings and disposition from changing, according to the variety of accidents which occur. St. Francis de Sales. Tolerus relates that there was once a great theologian who for 8 years in succession prayed to God to show him someone who would teach him the way of truth, and that, finally, when he was one day offering this prayer with great fervor, he heard a voice from heaven saying to him, "Go to the temple, and there you shall find him." He went and found a poor beggar on the church steps, half clothed with a few rags and covered with sores. Moved with compassion, he saluted him kindly with the words, "God give you a good day, my good man." "I never had a bad day," said the beggar with a cheerful look. "God gives you good fortune," went on the theologian. "I have never experienced any misfortune," answered the other. "How is this?" exclaimed the theologian. "You have never had bad days and never experienced misfortunes, loaded as you are with woe and miseries." "I will tell you," replied the mendicant. "I have cast myself wholly upon the Divine Will, to which I so conform my own, that whatever God wills, I will also. So when hunger, thirst, cold, heat, or sickness molest me, I do nothing but praise God. And whatever happens to me, whether it be prosperous or adverse, whether it be pleasing or unpleasant, I take all from the hand of God with great gladness, as that which can but be good. For it comes from a cause which can produce only what is best." "But," went on the theologian, "if God should choose to send you to hell, what would you do?" "I would immediately plunge into it," returned the beggar. "For, see, I have 2 arms. One is humility, by which I keep myself always attached to His most sacred humanity; the other is love, which attaches me to His divinity. Now, if He were to cast me into hell, I would cling to Him so tightly with these 2 arms that He would be obliged to come with me, and with such companionship it would not grieve me much even to be in hell." "Who can you be?" wondered the theologian. "I am a king," was the answer. "And where is your kingdom?" "In my soul; for I know so well how to rule my faculties, both interior and exterior, that all the powers, inclinations, and affections of my soul are completely subject to me." "Tell me, how did you learn such great perfection?" "By recollection, meditation, and union with God. I was never able to find peace in anything less than God, before I succeeded in finding Him, and since then I enjoy continual peace." "And where did you find Him?" "Where I left affection for all other things." 17. In this holy abandonment springs up that beautiful freedom of spirit which the perfect possess, and in which there is found all the happiness that can be desired in this life. For in fearing nothing, and seeking and desiring nothing of the things of the world, they possess all. St. Teresa. One of these beautiful souls was that of St. Francis de Sales. In whatever happened to him he always showed as much satisfaction as if all had gone according to his wishes. For example, when a fierce persecution had been raised against him and the order he had founded, he wrote thus to St. Jane Frances de Chantal: "I leave all these opposing blasts to the providence of God. Let them blow or cease, as shall please Him. Tempest and calm are equally dear to me. If the world did not speak ill of us, we should not be the servants of Christ." The Emperor Ferdinand II. made this prayer every day: "O Lord, if it be indeed for Thy glory and my salvation that I retain the position in which I am, keep me in it, and I will glorify Thee. If it be to Thy praise and my good that I sink to a lower place, abase me, and I will glorify Thee." Father Alvarez never thought about what was to happen to him, and if any thought of the kind offered itself, he would say, "It will be as God wills." Then, raising his heart to God, he would add, "O Lord, I wish for nothing but to please Thee and satisfy Thee." 18. How beautiful it is to behold a person destitute of all attachment, ready for any act of virtue or charity, gentle to all, indifferent as to any employment, serene in consolations and tribulations, and wholly content if only the will of God be done. St. Francis de Sales. Behold how this saint, without intending it, has depicted himself to the life. For he was precisely such a person as is here described, as may be seen from many incidents recorded in this work. 19. When we have totally abandoned ourselves to the pleasure of God, submitting without any reserve our will and affections to His dominion, we shall see our souls so united to His Divine Majesty that we shall be able to say with that perfect model of Christians, St. Paul, "In myself I no longer live, but Jesus Christ in me." St. Francis de Sales. This saint, according to the testimony of one who knew him intimately, in the last years of his life had reached to the point that he desired, loved, or regarded only God in all things. As a result, he seemed always absorbed in God, and said that there was nothing in the world which could satisfy him except God. He frequently uttered with ecstatic feeling these words of the psalmist: "Lord, what is there in heaven for me, or what do I desire upon earth, save Thee? Thou art my portion and my inheritance forever." All that was not God was nothing for him, and this was one of his principal maxims. 20. When one seeks to unite himself to God, he should endeavour to discover, by self-examination, whether there is anything which forms a barrier between his soul and God, and whether in anything he seeks himself or turns back to himself. Blessed Enrique Sossone. St. John Berchmans, after examining himself to see whether he had an attachment to anything whatever, found that there was nothing on earth for which he felt or could feel affection. This he expressed in a sentence found among his manuscripts: "Nulli rei sum affectus, et nihil habeo cum affecta." A gentleman of very high family, who had passed most of his life at court, guiding himself by the maxims of the world, was finally gained over for God by St. Vincent de Paul, and applied himself so earnestly to the pursuit of perfection that he became a model to all. Desiring still to advance, and feeling sure the more he separated himself from creatures, the more he would be united to God, he often examined himself as to whether he had any attachment for relatives, friends, honours, property, or comforts, and, whenever he discovered anything that was an entanglement to him, he immediately broke or cut it away. One day he made his usual examination, while riding on horseback, and could think of nothing for which he specially cared, until he finally perceived that he had a fondness for his sword, which had saved his life in many duels. Instantly springing from the horse, he went up to a large stone, upon which he shivered it to pieces. Afterwards he told the incident to St. Vincent, and assured him that this act gave him such complete freedom that he never after felt affection for any perishable thing. 21. The condition of union seems to be nothing else than dying, so to speak, entirely to all the things of the world and living in the enjoyment of God. St. Teresa. This was the blessed state of St. Catherine of Genoa, who confessed that she once had a vision in which it was shown her how all good proceeds from God, without any previous cause except His pure and simple goodness, by which He was moved to do us good in so many ways and forms. "From that sight," she said, "there rose in my heart such an interior flame of love that I lost all understanding, thought, wish, or love for anything except God, so that my soul neither knows nor can wish for anything more or other than it is enjoying at present, and is more pleased and satisfied with this than with anything it could obtain by all its efforts and exertions. And if I should ask myself what I desire or aim at, I could only answer, Nothing except what love gives me. He keeps me so occupied and satisfied with Himself that I have no need to plan or seek for anything to sustain my powers, supported and sustained as they are." 22. The soul which remains attached to anything, even to the least thing, however many its virtues may be, will never arrive at the liberty of the divine union. It matters little whether a bird be fastened by a stout or a slender cord, as long as he does not break it, slender as it may be, it will prevent him from flying freely. Oh, what a pity it is to see some souls, like rich ships, loaded with the precious freight of good works, spiritual exercises, virtues, and favors from God, which, for want of courage to make an end of some miserable little fancy or affection, can never arrive at the port of divine union, while it only needs one good earnest effort to break asunder that thread of attachment. For, to a soul free from attachment to any creature, the Lord cannot fail to communicate Himself fully, as the sun cannot help entering and lighting up an open room when the sky is clear. St. John Chrysostom. It is related in the life of St. Gregory that a rich man left the world and retired into a wood, taking with him, to afford him some recreation in that solitude, only a little cat, as he loved it and often caressed it. After living thus for some years in a constant course of prayers and penances, he prayed the Lord to be pleased to show him what reward was prepared for him. Then God revealed to him that he might hope for a place in heaven equal to that which Pope Gregory would receive. The good hermit was much grieved at this information, and could not understand why one who had left all he had for God, and had served Him with such austerity, should not receive a greater reward than one who was living in the midst of riches and luxury. But the Lord opened his eyes by showing him that he was more attached to his cat than Gregory to all the riches and honors he enjoyed, and that perfection consists precisely in detachment from all that is not God. The nuns of the Visitation make special profession of detachment from everything, as they cannot appropriate to themselves the smallest article, not even a needle. To maintain this excellent spirit in its full vigor, and prevent them from becoming attached to any object, their rule requires them to exchange with one another every year the articles of which they make use, their rooms, books, furniture, everything, even the crosses they wear upon their bosoms. 23. See why we never arrive at sanctification after so many communions as we make. It is because we do not suffer the Lord to reign in us as He would desire. He enters our breasts and finds our hearts full of desires, affections, and trifling vanities. This is not what He seeks. He would wish to find them quite empty, in order to render Himself absolute master and governor of them. St. Francis de Sales. The Saint himself possessed a heart of this latter kind. His confessor testifies of him that he would permit no affection to remain in it that was not of God and for God. And so, if he saw anything alien to this springing up, he was ready to extirpate it, as it were, with steel and fire. The Lord once said to a good soul that the best disposition for receiving abundant graces in Holy Communion is to empty the heart of everything. For, if a great noble goes to the house of one of his retainers, with the intention of filling all his boxes and chests, but finds them full of chaff and earth and sand, he is forced to retire with regret. This is the reason why holy souls have been so earnest in making good communions. The Empress Leonora, who received 3 times a week, spent 2 hours in previous meditation, and wore a girdle of haircloth and chains with sharp points wound several times about her arms. After receiving, she remained for a quarter of an hour prostrate, with her face upon the ground, conversing with her divine guest in sweet and tender welcome. Then, to retain the warmth of devotion through the day, she remained in silence and solitude in her room. St. Aloysius Gonzaga gave the whole week to his Communion. He offered his actions of the 3 days preceding it, as a preparation, and so endeavoured to do them well, and those of the 3 following days he intended for thanksgiving. The venerable Monsignor de Palafox, after his conversion, and while still a secular, communicated often, that is, once a week. He took up the practice of asking God for one virtue at each Communion, and resolving to extirpate some particular fault, occupying in this sometimes days, sometimes whole weeks. He thus endeavoured, by the aid of Divine grace, to conquer his evil inclinations, and to change his long established habits, with a success that could be noticed from day to day. St. John Berchmans was unwilling to receive Communion on holidays, because, as he said, he could not preserve the necessary quiet and devotion on such days, and if he was to communicate, he asked permission to remain in the house. He said, on one occasion, that each time he received Holy Communion, he felt his soul perceptibly revived and invigorated. 24. To arrive at perfect union there is needed a total and perfect mortification of the senses and desires. The shortest and most effectual method of attaining it is this. As to the senses, whatever pleasing object may offer itself to them, unconnected with pure love to God, we should refuse it to them instantly, for the love of Jesus Christ, who in this life neither had nor desired to have any pleasure except to do the will of his Father, which he called his food. If, for example, there should arise a fancy or wish to hear or see things which do not concern the service of God, or lead especially to Him, we should deny this fancy and refrain from beholding or hearing these things. But if this is not possible, it is sufficient not to consent with the will. Then, as to the desires, we should endeavour to incline always to what is poorest, worst, most laborious, most difficult, most unpleasant, and to desire nothing except to suffer and be despised. St. John of the Cross. Such, in truth, was the life of this saint, which he passed in the continual exercise of interior and exterior mortification, of which he never seemed to have enough, and in this way he attained to great union with God. St. Francis Borgia often prayed the Lord to make all the pleasures of this life painful to him, and he strove to render them so himself as far as he was able. And so he desired with avidity, sought with solicitude, and embraced with gladness all that was contrary to self-love in food, clothing, and habitation. By this means he made great progress in virtue and holy union. 25. If you desire to arrive at union with God, let your conversation and manner of life be as interior as possible. Do not reveal yourself or come forth from yourself, either by words, gestures, or manners, but strive to keep yourself within yourself, turning to God alone, who is present within you, and excluding from your heart all that you shall see or hear. Blessed Enrico Sassone. Father Alvarez, being asked the reason why he had seemed unusually thoughtful for some days, answered, I am trying to live as if I were in the deserts of Africa, and to keep my heart as much at a distance from all creatures as if I really were in the desert. And in this he succeeded. St. Rose of Lima made unusual efforts to conceal not only the good works and penances that she performed, but even the spiritual gifts which she received from the Lord, never revealing them without necessity, even to her directors. A person of high rank once had a great desire to know the special favours this saint enjoyed, and pressed her spiritual father to elicit an account of them from her. Though he foresaw that it would be very difficult, yet he was so desirous to grant the favour that he tried to accomplish it under various pretexts and with much persuasion. The pious maiden soon perceived the object of these artifices, and, in the humblest words, entreated him not to question her about the matter. She said that from her earliest years she had most frequently supplicated her spouse that no one might ever discover what he had wrought in her out of his pure goodness, and as the good God had granted this, his minister should not take away a favour which he had bestowed. St. Thomas Aquinas from his earliest youth was constantly seeking to know God. When he had become a religious, his sole gratification was to think, to speak, and to hear of God, so that, if anything was introduced in general conversation which was not connected with God, he paid no attention to it, as a matter which did not concern him. He so directed to God and His good pleasure all his works and actions, that when the Lord Himself asked him what reward he would desire for the many works He had written for Him, "No other," he replied, but Thyself alone, my Lord and my Love. 26. Be immovable in this resolution, to remain simply in the presence of God, by means of an entire renunciation and abandonment of yourself into the arms of His most holy will. Every time that you find your spirit outside this dear abode, lead it back gently, without making any formal acts of the understanding or will. For this love of simple confidence, and this reliance and repose of the soul upon the paternal bosom of the Divine Goodness, includes all that can be desired to please God. St. Francis de Sales. This was the favorite exercise of St. Jane Frances de Chantal, which she practised by means of a simple glance towards God, a simple acquiescence in His most holy will, by resting simply in it, as a little child in the arms and upon the bosom of its mother, without seeking to do anything else, or trying to examine what the Lord was working in her, or why He was doing it. In this she found her most complete repose, as she confessed in an account that she gave of herself to her director. "I feel my soul," she said to him, "much inclined to sustain itself by a simple glance raised to God and His divine goodness. Though I no longer feel that total abandonment and sweet confidence which I once felt, and though I cannot even make an act of it, yet it seems to me that by this glance alone these virtues become more firm and solid than ever, and if I were to follow my interior impulse, I should practice nothing else." To check any disposition to redundancy of words, she wrote upon a card a long prayer, including many petitions, praises, and thanksgivings for her friends and relatives, and all for whom she was under obligation to pray, whether living or dead. She hung this card around her neck, and wore it night and day, having previously stipulated with Our Lord that whenever she pressed it to her bosom, she should be considered as offering all the prayers it contained. Among the many practices of devotion which the Venerable Sister Maria Crucifixa employed in thanksgiving after Communion, one was to place Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament at rest in her soul, as if He were sleeping there, while she stood at His side, watching Him in humble silence, and obliging all her faculties, both interior and exterior, to refrain from all exercise which was not directed to Him, and from every act except such as showed reverence for Him, that by an ill-timed activity they might not awake her Beloved. Thus she kept all her powers long abased in silent reverence, occupied only with Jesus lying in her heart. She confessed that she had derived greater profit from this exercise than from any other. She took care, however, in her previous preparation, to furnish the place well for Him, with devout affections and various acts, that He might rest with less discomfort. 27. When I see some persons very anxious about being attentive in prayer, and keeping their heads bowed while occupied in it, as if they did not dare to stir in the least, or to move even in thought, that the joy and sensible devotion they have may not leave them even in the slightest degree, this shows me how little they understand the road which leads to union, while they imagine that the whole affair consists in keeping their thoughts fixed. No, no, the Lord desires works. Therefore, when things present themselves to be done, to which obedience or charity obliges you, do not at all regard losing that devotion and enjoyment of God that you may give Him pleasure by doing these things, for they will lead you more quickly than the others to holy union. St. Teresa. The Blessed Clara de Montefalco willingly employed herself in the work of the convent, and said that in it the gift of prayer even comes to its perfection. When St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi was a novice, she sometimes had permission from the mistress to spend in prayer the time which was allotted to her companions for work, but she did not accept this favour, saying that she was more willing to be occupied in any exercise of obedience, however laborious and humble, than in the very loftiest contemplation. When asked the reason, she replied, "Because in performing the duties of the Order and of obedience, I am sure of doing the will of God, of which I am not sure when I engage in prayer or other exercises, no matter how good and holy, which have been chosen by my own will." She had the same feeling in regard to charity to her neighbour, and preferred it to contemplation, dear as that was to her. For to aid her neighbour in spiritual or temporal employments, she was ever ready to leave prayer, contemplation, and every other spiritual delight. 28. Self-will, as God says by the prophet, is what spoils and corrupts our devotions, labours, and penances. Therefore, not to lose time and trouble, we must endeavour never to act from the impulse of nature, interest, inclination, temper, or caprice, but always from the pure and single motive of doing the will of God, and accustom ourselves to this in all things. This is the most effectual, nay, rather the only means of arriving safely and quickly at union with God. St. Vincent de Paul. It was the great and only anxiety of this Saint not to undertake anything to which he might not seem impelled by the divine will, and so he made it a rule never to engage by himself in new enterprises even for the glory of God, which he had so much at heart, but always waited until the will of the Lord should be manifested to him by superiors, or at least by the opinion of others, or the prayers which he made or asked, for his humility made him always distrust his own light and fear to be deceived. This most important truth was well understood by St. Catherine of Genoa, who spoke thus on the subject: "There is no pest more malignant than that of self-will, which is so subtle, so malicious, so deeply seated, which conceals itself in so many ways, and defends itself by so many reasons, that it seems indeed a demon. When it cannot gain direct obedience, it knows well how to win its way in some other form, and under various excuses and pretexts, such as health, necessity, charity, justice, perfection, suffering for God, giving good example, finding spiritual consolation, condescending to the weakness of others, while we are all the while seeking, contriving, and cherishing our own interests. I behold it in a sea of malice, so undemanded, so opposed to God, that He alone can rescue us from it, and since He sees this better than we, He has great compassion on us, and never ceases to send us inspirations, contradictions, and helps of all sorts to deliver us." 29. To attain union with God, all the adversities that He sends us are necessary, for His only aim is to consume all our evil inclinations from within and from without. Therefore slights, injuries, insults, infirmities, poverty, abandonment by friends and relatives, humiliations, temptations of the devil, and many other things opposed to our human nature, all are extremely needed by us, that we may fight until by means of victories we have extirpated all our evil inclinations, so that we may feel them no longer; nay, more, until all adversities no longer seem bitter to us, but rather sweet for God, we shall never arrive at the divine union. St. Catherine of Genoa. "That such is the truth in this matter," added the Saint, "I have proved by my own experience; for divine love sees that we hold so tenaciously to what we have chosen because it seems to us good and right and beautiful, and that we will not listen to a word against it, as we are blinded by self‐love; and so it makes a ruin of all that we love, by means of death, illness, poverty, hatred, discord, and detractions, together with scandals, lies, and disgrace falling upon our relatives, our friends, or ourselves, so that we do not know what to do with ourselves, as we are thus drawn away from everything we had cared for, and receive from all only pain and confusion, and know not why the Lord permits these events, which seem quite contrary to reason, both as regards God and the world. Therefore we torment ourselves, and strive and seek and hope to escape from so many ills, but can find no outlet. When divine love has held the soul for a time in this suspense, and in despair and disgust with all she had hitherto loved, then He reveals Himself to her with a countenance full of beauty and splendor; and as soon as the soul, stripped and destitute of every other help, beholds Him, she casts herself into His arms, and, after considering the divine operations of pure love, she says to herself: "O blind one, with what wast thou occupied? What didst thou seek? What didst thou desire? Seest thou not that here is all thou seekest and desirest, and all the delights thou wouldst possess? Dost thou not find here more than thou couldst ever desire? O divine love, with what sweet art thou hast drawn me to put aside all love of self, and to clothe myself with a love pure and full of all true joys. Now that I see the truth, I no longer complain except of my ignorance and blindness. And now I leave to Thee all care of myself, seeing clearly that Thou doest for me far better than I have the skill or power to do for myself. I no longer wish to regard anything but Thy operations, which only aim at what the soul truly wishes and desires, though from her blindness she knows not how to gain it." St. Elizabeth, daughter of the King of Hungary, after being left a widow, was expelled from her home, abandoned by all, and tried by detraction, affronts, and contempt. She endured all with much patience, or rather she was most happy to be able to bear such sufferings for the love of God, who rewarded her abundantly with the most precious gifts. 30. To acquire perfection in general, and all the virtues in particular, even to attaining union with God, it is necessary to set before ourselves an example which may serve as a guide for all our actions and all our progress. Now, it is certain that we can find no safer or grander example than that which God Himself has offered us in the person of His Divine Son, and happy is he who shall make the best copy of it. This, then, should be our book and our mirror, in which we ought to look, whatever circumstances may occur. That is, we should consider in what manner our Lord behaved in similar cases, and what instruction He has left us in regard to them, and then follow generously His sentiments and example. St. Vincent de Paul. It was the constant practice of this Saint to guide himself thus in all affairs, by the example and teaching of the Saviour, which he kept before his eyes, as a pattern in every action, so that, when he had to make any decision, to give any advice or recommendation, he instantly sought in the life and words of Christ some ground upon which to base it. And so he scarcely ever spoke without bringing in some word or action of the Son of God, which he would introduce in a wonderfully opposite manner. But if he could think of nothing which had any bearing upon the point, he would meditate a little before acting, and say to himself, "How would Christ speak or act in this case?" and then immediately did what he thought the Lord would have done. In the Chronicles of St. Francis we are told that one of his religious had a vision in which he saw a path thickly set with briars, and at the opening of it stood St. Francis with many of his followers. In their midst was Jesus Christ, who said to them, "This is the way we must go," and he immediately began to advance into it. The religious were alarmed, and considered the undertaking too difficult, but the Saint encouraged them, saying that it should be enough for them to walk in the footprints of the Lord. He then set the example, and they all followed with much ease. 31. Oh, what remorse we shall feel at the end of our lives when we look back upon the great number of instructions and examples afforded by God and the Saints for our perfection, and so carelessly received by us. If this end were to come to you to-day, how would you be pleased with the life you have led this year? St. Francis de Sales. St. Vincent de Paul used often to say, "O wretched me! What an account I shall have to render at the tribunal of God, where I am so soon to appear, of the many graces His divine goodness has bestowed upon me, if I have derived no fruit from them." St. John Birchmans was so attentive to his own perfection that whatever he learned in regard to it remained impressed upon his mind, and he put it into practice with the greatest exactness. Thomas à Kempis tells of a pious person who one day fell into great anxiety in regard to his final perseverance. Prostrating himself before an altar, he raised his eyes and exclaimed, "Oh, if I only knew that I was to persevere in good to the end!" He instantly heard an interior voice that replied, "Well, if you knew, what would you do? Do now what you would wish to have done in that hour, and you will be in perfect security." Consoled by this, he abandoned himself entirely into the hands of God, without further inquiry as to the good or bad state of his conscience, and rather endeavored to discover and fulfill the will of God to the best of his ability. In the Lives of the Fathers we read of an old monk who, when asked what exercise should be employed to attain perfection, made this answer: "From the day I left the world I have said to myself every morning, 'To-day thou art born again. Begin now to serve God and to live in this holy place. Commence thy life each day as if the following one were to end it. This I have done without missing a day.'" Monsignor de Palafox, as we read in his life, at the very beginning of his conversion, had the light from on high, by which he understood that he ought to live day by day, that is, to take all possible care to live as if he believed each day that he was then to die, and render his account to God. He acted in this manner through the whole remainder of his life, and he confessed that a method so sure to give him satisfaction at the hour of death had also been of great value during his life. It is thus we should profit in our lives by the lights that God gives us, if we desire in death to rejoice at having received them. The End. End of Section 24. End of A Year with the Saints. Translated by a member of the Order of Mercy.